Good morning, and thank you for coming to Inventing America's conference, Building a Better Future with a Stronger Patent System. My name is Laurie Self, and I am Vice President and Counsel for Government Affairs at Qualcomm, which is a member of the Innovation Alliance. It is my pleasure today to present you a great group of panelists from a variety of industries, universities, and backgrounds to discuss how a strong patent system can boost economic growth and job creation, stimulate human flourishing, and empower people. We don't often talk about those last 2 points, human flourishing and empowering the powerless, but those are also byproducts of a healthy innovation ecosystem. Nobel laureate economist Edmund Phelps has rightly argued that innovation is good not just because we thrive economically, but our spirits thrive by enhancing our creative instincts. Over the past several years, the courts, the Congress, and the executive branch have aggressively pursued so-called abusive patent litigation behavior. And as a result, there have been significant legal changes to the patent system. Many of these changes have harmed economic growth and innovation by making the obtaining and protecting of a patent in the United States very difficult. Just this year, the United States has dropped from number 1 to number 10 in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's International IP Index for Patents, tied with Hungary and behind Italy, the UK, Sweden, Germany, Spain, Singapore, and others. Our first panel will discuss the relationship between patents and job creation in the 21st century and how policymakers can reinvigorate the American dynamism that once made innovation so rewarding. According to a 2016 study sponsored by the USPTO and Harvard and NYU business schools, total economic activity from patents has been estimated at over $8 trillion, over a third of US GDP. However, weakening of the patent system through recent legislation and case law undermines this economic growth by making it harder for innovators to get access to capital, generate new jobs, and continue inventing. In addition to boosting the innovation economy, strong patent protections help underrepresented communities access capital and create new innovations to solve society's problems. Additionally, giving these underrepresented communities greater access to patents can improve social mobility and reduce inequality by providing a vital entrepreneurial tool. Our second panel will discuss how addressing the disparities in the patent system will unleash a new pool of innovators that will start businesses, increase employment, create new inventions, and improve social mobility. Following our second panel, we'll have a brief working lunch and return for former USPTO Director David Kappos to interview Representatives Paul Gosar of Arizona and Bill Foster of Illinois, founders and co-chairs of the Congressional Inventions Caucus. We are extraordinarily fortunate today to have Representatives Gosar and Foster here. Their work in the House reflects a laudable bipartisan effort, proving that defending the innovation economy, entrepreneurship, and enterprise is not a partisan issue. We look forward to their remarks. Now, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Mike Waring, who's going to kick things off with our first panel. If Mike could go ahead and come up. Mike is the Executive Director of Federal Relations and the Washington, D.C. office for the University of Michigan, where he has worked since 2000. At the University of Michigan, Mike is responsible for developing and coordinating the relations between the university, the federal government, educational associations, professional societies, and public policy organizations. Mike's work ensures that the university's R&D investments are protected and that inventions have commercial pathways to share innovations with society. We are grateful to have him here with us today, and like me, Mike is passionate about patents and innovation. Please give Mike a warm welcome.
Well, thank you, Laurie, for that very kind introduction. Good to see all of you here today, lots of familiar faces, and the patent discussion in Washington continues unabated. So I always view it as the Mike Waring Full Employment Act, but that's okay. Anyway, I'm really happy to be here with this panel this morning to really look at how patents do drive 21st century jobs. And the goal of this panel really is to sort of look at what's on the horizon in terms of new innovations and discoveries that are waiting to happen, and how the patent system either is or is not working to help advance those inventions. We have with us representatives of two innovative companies, the head of an association of university tech transfer professionals, and a patent law expert for the venture capital community, all to provide some perspectives on those topics today here. And hopefully we'll all be educated a little bit about the opportunities and the challenges that innovators face here in 2017. Let me just introduce our panelists real quickly. Starting immediately to my right is Kevin Rhodes, Vice President, Chief IP Counsel for the 3M Company. He also serves as President of IPO. He's also been a member of the Coalition for 21st Century Patent Reform. Next to him is Susie Armstrong, Senior Vice President of Engineering for Qualcomm. She was very involved in helping bring internet protocols to the cellular telephone industry and helped Qualcomm develop packet data in the late 1990s. Most recently, she's joined the Government Affairs Group, where she brings her engineering and product background to bear on worldwide public policy, including IP protection, trade, immigration reform, and STEM issues. Next to Susie is Steve Susalka, who is CEO of the Association of University Technology Managers, or shorthand AUTM, which represents over 3,000 tech transfer professionals worldwide and here in the U.S. Steve has more than 10 years' experience in tech transfer, helped create a number of startups. He was most recently at Wake Forest University. Before that, did licensing for the University of Virginia Patent Foundation. He actually has a doctorate in neuroscience, so if anybody has a headache later, see Steve, he'll take care of you. And way down at the end, last but certainly not least, Bob Taylor, founder and owner of RPT Legal Strategies in San Francisco and Palo Alto, also serves as a venture advisor to the New Enterprise Associates and as a patent law expert for the National Venture Capital Association. He's been doing patent litigation for over 30 years, and for many years he co-chaired the Antitrust Committee of IPO. So thanks to all these folks for being with us today to bring their perspectives on our topic at hand. And so rather than just have each of them do a presentation with slides and that sort of thing, what we're really going to do, I'm going to try to just interview them for the next little while here and talk about some of these issues and bring out the information in that way. Hopefully they'll pick up on each other's comments as we go forward. And then later on, we'll have a chance for you all to jump into the discussion with questions and comments, so please be ready to engage with us. I see microphones on either side of the room, so please feel free to use those and identify yourself when you have a question or comment. So I'm going to start with Kevin from 3M. Clearly, 3M is a company with a long history of innovation. And so, Kevin, kind of what's your company's general view about the patent system and the role it plays in innovation? So, let's start there.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here, have an opportunity to talk about American innovation and to get to share the stage and the room with inventors and a distinguished lineup of IP professionals. And you know, innovation is a subject that has been the cornerstone of 3M's success for our 115 years that we've been in existence. Today, we invest about $1.6 billion a year in our R&D. We have 46 different technology platforms, everything from abrasives and adhesives, sort of the foundation of 3M as an industrial company, to sensors and electronics and software technology platforms. We take those technologies and we combine them into products to the tune of about 55,000 different products. We tend to place our bets on innovation and on our commercialization in areas where we can be the market leader. So as a result, we try to be into the market early with innovative technologies, and we try to preserve that differentiation in the marketplace through legal rights such as patents. So patents really provide for us the legal foundation to secure the investments that are often, lengthy, costly, and uncertain in R&D and commercialization and manufacturing and in jobs for our products. So patents are really, and other forms of IP, but particularly patents, are really integrated into our business model. They provide that foundation upon which we innovate and we allocate our both R&D and commercialization investments.
So Kevin, we all know about Post-it notes, a great invention, sort of a serendipitous invention.
Yeah.
But what are some of the latest innovations your company's working on these days? What do you think we'll see in the next few years coming out of 3M that will be kind of cool new things?
So I think, Mike, sort of across the board of those 55,000 products, a common theme that really is playing out at 3M, and I think many other companies, is increasing information and communications technologies. So really digitization and electronic content in our products. And that's everything from, sort of our traditional industrial and materials businesses, so such things, for example, as connected roadways. So, we have a long-standing business in reflective sheeting that's used on signage, on pavement markings. Those are being enabled with communications protocols to communicate with autonomous vehicles. So you've all heard of the autonomous vehicles, and we think of those and the timeline to get to those, which is anticipated by 2030, we'll have fully autonomous vehicles. We think about the positioning of those by GPS, but in reality, you need redundant systems, because anybody who's tried to use your GPS tracker in your car, recalculating is probably not an option when your car is driving itself, right? So you need to communicate with pavement markings, with signs, with perhaps transmitters along the roadways, so we can use our materials expertise to branch out and create that ecosystem, that autonomous driving ecosystem. And so we'll get into this, Mike, but some of the challenges in patenting those types of inventions that go into electronics and software are challenges that we're facing in our IP function right now. Similar story, one other example is asthma inhalers. So asthma inhalers are 50 years old. They tend to be sort of just purely mechanical devices today. We're developing a digital inhaler that not only measures the quality of your breathing, and the dosage of the medicament and how much is left and when you have to take your next dose, but also can communicate with your healthcare provider, with healthcare payors, and really coordinate your treatment. And so that's another example where old technology with the medicament and the mechanical delivery with the actuator, the dose canner, is being digitized for the modern economy.
That's great. That's great. Well, autonomous vehicles, you're seeing in the University of Michigan song because we are one of the leaders in that whole area. In fact, we have the only test track for autonomous vehicles in the United States right now, which we build ourselves on campus, and they're building another one nearby, but we're all over that issue, so that's great. Susie, I want to talk to you. Obviously, Qualcomm, it's like 3M, very innovative company, been around for decades. What are some of the new things that you guys are working on there?
Well, I just decided right now that Kevin and I are going to create a company. You can join, and we're going to do connected roadways.
I like it. I like it. I'm all over it.
But we're a systems company, and we're basically at the heart of everything you love about your cell phone. We do everything we do pretty much everything that lies below the surface of wireless communications, both broadband, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi. And a lot of the things that we're working on now are the engines, if you will, that drive the things like flying drones and autonomous cars. And one of my colleagues said, so Susie, you're going to try to make semiconductor process technology sexy in this talk? And I'm not going to go that far. But the point is that all these things require incredible investment, and that investment only comes when it's protected by a set of patents. Whether you're doing materials research or you're doing building systems or you're trying to create low-power chips to go in watershed management that only have to have a battery replaced every 10 years. These are not things that just fall out of the sky or somebody wakes up and invents and they put into place the next week. These are all things that require tremendous risk, defining the use cases, and that's what Qualcomm does, is we build every engine there is to drive any sort of wireless communications. But more than that, anything that runs on top of wireless communications, we often are doing research and filing patents on and investing in so that we can drive that mobile technology. I think the BCG report that came out in 2015 talked about something like 11 million jobs in the whole mobile industry. And so it's not just the patents and the good and the investment that comes to Qualcomm that comes out of these new technologies and products. It's also what that gives rise to in the broader industry, the apps and the connected roadways and these kinds of things.
So what about your view? How does, now, Kevin shared there sort of the 3M view of the role patents play. How does Qualcomm view it? In a similar vein?
Yeah, so Qualcomm, and I, being an engineer for 23 years in Qualcomm, and 10 years before that at Xerox, I sort of lived this, and I joined Qualcomm in the early 90s when we were just trying to get CDMA out the door and accepted by the industry and the community, who said it would never work. We had to invest a tremendous amount of money in building not only what we build now, the chipsets and such, but building phones, building base stations, building the infrastructure, because we had to show that this worked. And that kind of investment is only possible when you're confident you're going to have patents and a strong patent system to protect it. And that it also, you know, we believe at Qualcomm, and I believe it's sort of a snowball effect. When you have that kind of innovation and you have the patents to protect it and incentivize the investment, then in the 2000s, we hired thousands of engineers to work on the technologies that CDMA first gave rise to. And, you know, Mike mentioned that I worked on the early internet software. We surfed the net on this phone in 1997 at the CTIA show on this screen, and we're very proud. But these kinds of things on the voice channel at 14 kilobits a second, and we're very, very proud. But these kinds of, the point is that these kinds of inventions, if you will, lead to other inventions. We spent the next 10 years, other inventions and other jobs, and we spent the next 10 years doing things like adding camera capabilities. So you went from this phone to this phone, display capabilities, faster and faster and more responsive air links. And so that's sort of the history of Qualcomm and inventions. And going forward, we also need that kind of patent protection so that we can invest in IoT in our new company with autonomous driving vehicles and magnetic wireless charging roadways. And without that in investment, you can't hire the engineers and the researchers to make these innovations, and without the patents to protect that investment, it just doesn't go anywhere.
So Steve, university technology folks are at the very front end of this whole innovation continuum from the lab to the marketplace, and most of the ideas that we churn out are pretty early stage. They need more work to be fully developed to become a commercializable product. So what are some of the success stories we've seen in the past from that process? And kind of what are the challenges that people in your profession face as they try to figure out which discoveries on their campus are going to be the next great product to get to the marketplace?
Sure. So if there are two things that I'd like you to remember from at least my segment of this presentation, number one is universities are the breeding ground for the next generation of inventions. Companies as well have a tremendous capability and success in doing that, but universities create so many of those inventions that you've already used today, will use tomorrow, wearing today, and so on. So that's the first thing I want you to know. The second thing is the critical link between a university that invents that technology, but of course, universities don't sell products, companies sell products. That link is intellectual property protection, and the importance of a strong patent system in allowing that transmission from an invention to a commercial product. So let me give you a couple of examples. And there's so many, I'm just going to hit a couple. Right now, you guys have vitamin D fortified milk in your coffee. You can thank the University of Wisconsin for developing that process. You are probably wearing new fabrics that were developed at North Carolina State. If you are an allergy sufferer, you can thank Georgetown for the creation of Allegra. Laser cataract surgery, MRIs, CAT scans, 153 drugs, vaccines, and new indications that have been FDA approved all came from public sector research institutions. So there is just a remarkable amount of intellectual property that is developed at universities. And as a taxpayer, as you are, I'm happy to see that my tax funds are being used in part to support research. That research is leading to those next generation of drugs and devices, and it's not all medical. There are engineering, LED lights, for example. There is a whole host of other inventions that have been developed out of universities. I will tell you, this has gotten much more personal for me in the last week, and that is my father had quadruple bypass surgery last week. And thanks to the University of Minnesota, who developed the first heart-lung transplant, or heart-lung device that kept my father alive during that open heart surgery, he's around today. So again, that's a personal question, or it's a personal statement on the importance of intellectual property developed at universities.
Well, and just to build on that, Steve, I know that in the last couple of weeks, Autumn and the Biotech Association, put out a joint report that kind of talked about all the economic impact of this work over the last 20 years. Why don't you speak to a couple of the high points of that report?
Sure. So, at the end of the day, it's about the products and the services that are created, impact on me, my family, you, your family. But you can also actually look at the economic impact. And so hopefully on each of your chairs, you guys saw a little flyer that describes some of the impact of university intellectual property. And so just to summarize, over a 20-year period, university technology transfer has led to up to $591 billion to the GDP in the U.S. That's sales of final sales of products and services. $1.33 trillion in gross output. That's kind of GDP plus all the stuff that happens in the middle. And up to 4.2 million jobs. So in addition to all those different inventions I described and others you're probably not even aware of, there is a significant economic impact both in GDP as well as jobs and new job creation. Also on the same page, what you'll see is just in 2015, the latest year we have data for, over 1,000 startup companies were created to take those next generation of inventions to market that will allow new products and services, new jobs, larger tax base. So university technology transfer is very important in the field.
Right. So Bob Taylor, you work very closely with the venture capital community that Steve's group depends on and others who are going to begin new businesses rely on to kickstart these new technologies. So what role are patents playing in the decisions that the venture capital community are making right now, and what trends do you see going on right now?
Certainly a lot of the companies funded by venture capital today still are very dependent on patents. Certainly on the medical device side, the biotech pharma side, and some of the non-healthcare related. However, the trend is more and more venture capital is going to companies with shorter horizons that don't require long-term investments that depend on patents. To some extent, that's because investors have become very jaded about the ability to enforce patents, the cost of enforcing patents, and the value of having patents. And so more and more venture capital funding is going into consumer product kinds of businesses, internet applications, and one of the things that you see, it's hard to quantify this trend, but when you see a company like Uber that has yet to make any profit and has a market valuation or a valuation for the purpose of transactions north of $70 billion. The reason for that is because a lot of the venture capital firms that are putting money into a company like Uber see it as a better investment than starting a new company that is going to depend on patents and that has a 4 or 5 maybe a 10-year horizon.
Interesting. Because you watch that show Shark Tank, and of course one of the first questions they always ask these inventors is, do you have a patent for this thing you've just invented. And I guess what you're saying is that the patent has become less important to the venture capital community.
To the community as a whole. Now, Kevin O'Leary is the guy that usually asks that question, and he is a passionate believer in the patent system.
Right.
And there are a lot of venture capitalists still that are, but the system itself is not functioning well enough to create the kinds of incentives to start new companies.
And what do you think has been the cause of that? Why is it because of the court decisions, or has it been the threat of legislation? What's been the trigger for that, do you think?
I'm reflecting on how to moderate what I say about that.
Okay, sure.
I think 15 years of a Supreme Court that doesn't have any understanding of the relationship between patents and innovation in America has left the system bereft of any real value for many of the startups that want to get started. And there's a decline in the number of companies that are starting new businesses. If you look at the data, I saw a report a couple of days ago from an organization in Chicago called EIG, and the data shows that up until 2008, for reaching back 30 years, we had a net growth of new companies coming into the pipeline. And since 2008, we've seen a decline in new companies. The failure of companies is greater than the number of new companies that are getting started. That has a long-term implication for our country.
Right. So Steve mentioned about the tech transfer, and they always rely on outside investment to sort of get this going, either from a company or from an investor, or an angel investor, a venture investor. So how would you characterize the relationship between the venture community and universities in general?
A lot of the venture capital startups are coming out of universities, and I think Steve's absolutely correct that it's critical to have patents as the linkage between the company and the university.
Right. Okay. So I want to engage all of our panelists here with sort of some thoughts about, as we view kind of the lay of the land, the landscape for patents these days. Let me get your views on that, and if anything needs to be done to make it work better. What would be some things that could be done to improve the system, if there was going to be? And let me just start with you, Kevin. From 3M's perspective, what needs to change to make the patent process work better so that you and your company and others can be more efficient, more innovative in the future?
Yeah, so I think, Bob started to touch on it a little bit. I think in a couple different ways, the innovation ecosystem has evolved, and patent law needs to keep up, and we need to revisit some of the recent developments in the law. So the first way I think Bob alluded to is, the speed of innovation is faster than it's ever been. And some of these spaces that we were talking about moving into, the rate of change is just unprecedented. And so we need to make sure that, we talk at 3M about the legal department sort of working at the speed of business, right? So we have to be there to give advice in a timely manner that's useful to our business clients. Same thing for the patent system. The patent system needs to work at the speed of innovation in the modern economy. And I think, that's a challenge for the Patent Office to issue high-quality patents in a prompt way so they are meaningful at the early stages of development when you're trying to determine, if you're a company, whether to invest in that technology, if you're looking to attract investors, if you're a startup, or the university environment is exactly the same. I mean, patents provide that currency, that well-defined scope of rights that facilitate those transfers, so you can have an orderly sharing of information under the rubric of the legal rights, so where they lie and how the collaboration can take place. So that's issue one. Issue two then is, how reliable are patent rights, how enforceable are they? And I think that's where a couple of developments we really need to look at to see whether they are fostering our innovation economy. One is Section 101 jurisprudence. What is patent eligible subject matter? I think we're unfortunately in a situation right now where interpretation of the judicially created exceptions under Section 101 are denying patent eligibility to two of the most innovative sectors of our economy, life sciences, in particular personalized medicine, and computer implemented inventions, and in particular software. And I think the implications for that are profound on the innovation policy in this country, and those are policy questions that need to be made and really owned by Congress. I think having that policy developed on a case-by-case basis over years by the courts in a series of decisions on judicially made exceptions is not the right way to set our innovation policy. That really needs to come from Congress. The other area I think to look at in particular is the PTAB and the post-issuance review proceedings that were created by the American Invents Act. I think the way those have been implemented by the office to the tune of the patent office issuing patents that are then invalidated upon review. And pick your stat, 65, 70, 75% of the time, I think that's an unsustainable business model, that the very agency that's issuing those patents is saying that the overwhelming majority of them are not valid upon challenge. And we talked about, both Susie and I talked about using patents to secure long-term investments in commercialization, in manufacturing, in jobs. At some point, there needs to be a sense of quiet title on those patents. So serial challenges throughout the life of a patent, and this is not just a random sampling of issued patents. Our most valuable patents, the ones that we want to use and that others want to use, are the most likely ones that we will have to enforce and the most likely ones that will draw a post-issuance review, an IPR. And so the serial nature of those challenges and never really being sure when one will impact your patent, will knock out or limit your patent rights. It's a really tough discussion with decision makers on the business side right now about where they place investments if they can't rely on the patent rights that are constantly subject to challenge. And one of the implications of that is people are going to move to other forms of exclusivity, trade secrets or regulatory exclusivity, other ways to try to preserve that differentiation in the marketplace if patents are no longer a reliable differentiator. And that also has profound implications on our innovation economy and all the benefits of the patent system in terms of disclosure and innovation on top of those disclosures. We really need to think about what a move to other forms of exclusivity, legal exclusivity, would do to that policy.
Right. What about the rest of the panel? Other thoughts you might have about what are some of the things we need to address most directly, and what would be a solution that you might proffer if you have a thought about that?
Well, I am not an expert on patent policy or the legislature. I am a product of the patent system, but Qualcomm, to Bob's point here, with no disrespect to Uber, it takes thousands and thousands of people in the mobile industry on base stations, on the base station side, on the phone side, on the chipset side, to build a platform for companies like Uber or other companies making small apps to be able to make them. And so it's very alarming to me to see this American innovation engine sort of being stalled by people who have a much more short-term focus. So that's troubling. On the other hand, Qualcomm, recognizing both the need for future inventors and the need for workforce development, most of the patents, I believe, come out of a STEM area, science, technology, engineering, math. And so Qualcomm, this gives me a chance to use my prop. Qualcomm has a program called, it's called the ThinkBit Lab, and it's a STEM engagement program. What we're trying to do is show these kids that I think the statistics are there's a gap of 1.1 million jobs in 2024 in people who are qualified in STEM fields to fill those gaps. So we started out with the ThinkBit Lab looking at workforce training, and then we realized that this American innovation engine going forward is dependent on, the young people and the kids actually believing in a patent system, believing in innovation, being able to produce rather than just consume. And so in the in the Think a Bit Lab, what we do is we bring kids in, and we do it all in the lens of careers in these areas. And we expose them to, we go through a strengths and interests and values area. We expose them to things like, IoT concepts, consumer electronics, smart cities, smart homes, and we expose them to careers that are going to be in those areas. And we actually use the Department of Labor's ONET for the statistics on this career. I think we have a political scientist here, so it doesn't look so good in the upcoming it doesn't look so good in the upcoming years. But the point is, we want these kids to understand that they can invent the future, and we absolutely need a strong patent system to make sure that that innovation engine that provided, me with a job and thousands of, mobile industry with a job and pharmaceuticals with jobs, that industry and that patent industry is strong. And lastly, we target sixth graders right now, and mostly sixth graders from underserved areas. Girls, minorities, people. There's a lot of good STEM programs out there, but a lot of them don't target. A lot of kids, especially in middle school, are not aware that these are not exclusive, mysterious jobs, inventing and doing engineering. So this is my favorite IoT project done by a group of 3 sixth graders in the Think a Bit Lab in California. And what it is it's they go through this, they learn to program an Arduino board. This is all a one-day experience. And they then create an invention of their own making, and somebody should patent this. One of these kids should patent this. This is an invention that this group of kids created. These are little arms when you're sleeping in bed, and I like the dog next to you. When you're sleeping in bed and your alarm clock goes up in the morning, the arms look at a sensor, determine what clothes are dirty and what clothes are clean. It dresses you in bed, and then it puts on your makeup. So if we don't all need this, I don't know what we need. So the point is to make good on that promise of jobs and invention. We absolutely need to make sure that we have a strong patent system. So this thing we call the American Innovation Engine that we're so known for doesn't end up going awry. Because without that kind of innovation and without that kind of investment, there's not a patent system and there's not a set of jobs for these kids that are going into these STEM fields.
Yeah. So, but by the way, Susie will be selling these in the lobby afterwards. It's not too soon to plan for Christmas here.
Your props are way cooler than mine.
Yeah, exactly. We need that road in here somehow, the connected cars.
One of the questions that I have for Susie, and let me give a preface to this. I had the privilege about 2 weeks ago of visiting a company in Southern California that is the only privately funded, at least that I know of, the only privately funded company that's doing research into power generation using nuclear fusion, atomic fusion. A number of European entities are doing this at the governmental level, but this is an entirely venture-backed company. It's had several $100 million in funding over a period of 20 years to create what, when it comes to pass, and it will transform the planet in exactly the same way the internet has. The internet has allowed us to deliver information at essentially zero marginal cost, and the creation of electrical energy at zero marginal cost is going to be just absolutely transformative. And this was a very exciting company to be in, but it was started in 1998. And in 1998, we had a patent system that justified those kinds of investments. You couldn't raise money today to start this company. You couldn't today start this company despite the promise as a result of our patent system. Susie, I'd like to know whether you think someone setting out right now to create another Qualcomm in the face of governments and companies telling you it can't be done, whether you could get that company off the ground.
I don't think that you actually could, because for two reasons. As I said before, with all due respect to these wonderful apps that run, there's a notion in the tech world that you don't need patents and you want to be rich or be bought in, by the way, you need patents to be bought.
Fair price.
Yeah, in 2 years. So that's a very alarming look, and I'm not sure the current situation would actually support a Qualcomm and a nuclear. These things require 10 years and millions of dollars and jobs to actually come to fruition. And I don't see, what alarms me is, to build this, what kind of system do we have? And that sort of American, that's what I mean by the American innovation engine. I'm not sure there's a stomach in the public or in the government with all these attacks on sort of the innovation engine and the patent system to create a Qualcomm.
Steve, so technology folk, tech transfer people are in the middle of this process, and what do you hear from your members? What are their concerns in this sphere? What keeps them awake at night, worrying about the discoveries they have on their own campus as they deal with this system?
Right. So if you think about academic tech transfer, you've got research that leads to inventions. Those inventions are protected with intellectual property, generally patents, but there are other types as well. And those patents are licensed out to companies. There are a couple of bottlenecks in there that people are concerned about. The first is research funding. As you might have seen, research funding is declining from a federal government standpoint. And at least in universities, over 59% of all of our funding comes from the federal government. It's that research expenditures that lead to the next invention. So that's the first concern. So that funnel can be as wide open, but if you've got nothing going in it, nothing's coming out the other side. That's the first concern. The second concern, more germane to this conversation, is protecting of that intellectual property. So again, universities come up with incredible inventions. They need to protect those because no company is going to invest the amount of money and time and energy needed to move that invention into a product without some way to protect that intellectual property. That is the crucial part. And some of the changes that have occurred in terms of what's patent eligible. I worked on an invention that identified two particular genes that would be a great indicator of the recurrence of breast cancer. So, a simple two gene test. And again, early stage. Filed a patent application, moving this forward. Next thing I know, that type of invention is no longer patentable. It was patentable when we started. It wasn't patentable halfway through. That invention's never going forward. And hopefully there'll be other ones forward, but in the absence of being able to protect that, no company is going to move that forward. So I get concerned, and I know our members are concerned about the importance of intellectual property protection. And then you couple that with this post-serial challenges. Two patents that have gone through the process have found to be valid, are licensed to a company, and then they find out that under a completely different set of circumstances, now that patent's no longer valid. Well, that is going to keep that company from licensing the next piece of intellectual property going forward. So those are the concerns I have. Maybe I'll just end with kind of an example. So creation of penicillin. So you guys have heard this, a petri dish, left it too long, turns out developed penicillin. 1928. First person wasn't administered penicillin until 1942. No patent was filed, nothing went forward. They finally used it on a patient, used up half the amount of penicillin they had developed. And a couple months later, they had enough for 10 people in the United States. Someone developed a method to push this forward and create this much more efficiently, was filed in 1945, and you now have seen the impact of penicillin. If not for that, penicillin might not have ever seen the light of day.
Bob, is there a consensus among the VC the venture capital community about what needs to change for them to become more enthusiastic about investing in these sorts of things?
There's not really a consensus because venture capital firms themselves have kind of splintered in the same way that the investing process has. The large venture capital firms like New Enterprise Associates, which is the firm I know the best and do a lot of work with, has both a life science practice, a very robust life science practice, as well as a tech practice and a consumer practice. And certainly NEA and a number of the companies like them are strongly supportive of having a stronger patent system. The problem that we have in the venture world is every venture capitalist has had at least one company get up on the eve of financing and be taken advantage of by a strategically timed lawsuit that interferes with their financing, either knocks it completely off of the chart, which is, I had a client that had that happen. They were about ready to do an IPO. They got threatened with a patent suit, which had to be disclosed to the underwriter, and that was the end of the underwriting. And every VC has had something like that happen. And so part of patent reform from the standpoint of certainly the NVCA is some mechanism for addressing the strategically timed patent case, even if the patents are valid patents.
I want to encourage folks in the audience now to come to one of the microphones here and have address. We're going to leave plenty of time for questions and comments. So please, just if you line up at the microphones, I'll be happy to call upon you. We hear a lot about uncertainty leading to people actually feeling like other countries' patent systems are more reliable, that maybe they'll get their patent in Germany or some other place rather than here to start. Are you seeing that at the corporate level? Are other companies now saying, let's not mess with the U.S. patent, it's too common, let's go get a patent somewhere else? Is that a problem for folks?
So I will say, there have been some efforts to gather examples of that and look at that, and we did so at 3M, and we did find examples both in the EPO in Europe and in China where, and this comes back to the patent eligibility question, where we had applications for patents that had been rejected for on 101 grounds in the U.S. that were proceeding in each of those other patent offices. So yeah, I think, it ties in with Lori's opening remarks on where we are in the ranking of patent systems and innovation economies. This is a trend that goes to an issue of global competitiveness, and I think you can see it in terms of investment dollars, in terms of where R&D is taking place, and I think that those trends are going to accelerate if we don't look at some of these issues.
Are you seeing that? Are you guys seeing that?
It's certainly anecdotally correct. A number of lawyers and companies have told me that for them, the preferred forum for enforcing a patent today, if they can make it work in terms of the market, is Germany or the UK. China is coming along very rapidly as a country that will enforce patents, whether they're owned by Chinese companies or foreign companies. And we're going to see the growth of China because they're serious about becoming the dominant technology force in the 21st century.
And just to add to that, when I was in engineering, I spent a lot of time in China. We had Chinese customers for our chipsets and our licensing. And as of about 4 years ago, China started putting a real focus on invention, and there was all this anecdotal comments about the Chinese copy and such, but there's a lot of talent in China and a lot of very brilliant minds in China, and they're getting tremendous support from the government, both in terms of investment and in terms of their patent system, to encourage them to become the top patents.
They're also recruiting. They're recruiting entrepreneurs and scientists from other countries. There was a fascinating story in the Financial Times about a month ago about an Australian engineer that has taken a job in Beijing because the benefits were so attractive.
So we have a couple folks in the microphones. We'll start over here, and then we'll go over here. So you first. You just identify yourself and who you're representing today. There you go.
Hi, I'm Ellis Sudak, intern at Third Way, a little bit younger than most of the people here. But so my question's for Mr. Taylor. So you cited this stat that the rate of incorporation of new businesses for the first time ever is lower than the rate of destruction of new businesses. And so I've read the research on that stat. And so while that stat is correct on the total scale, the bulk of that business destruction, has been in mom and pop shops, the type of businesses that don't incorporate in Delaware, the ones that are named after the founders, the ones that don't really file patents. Whereas the rate of incorporation of high growth potential firms, the type that do incorporate in Delaware, are the ones that do file patents and drive the majority of our economic growth. Those firms continue to be incorporated at the same rate as they always have been. Given that this is true, how can you attribute the stalling of America's entrepreneurial engine to its weakening patent system?
It's a fair question, and all I can tell you is that I work with a lot of venture capital firms and with a lot of startups, and I have seen, and I've been doing this for 15 years, I did litigation in the early part of my career and gradually transitioned to more of an advisory role, and I've seen the shift. I've seen the numbers of new companies coming out of the VC pipeline that are just not interested in having patents. Primarily, that's the concern that I have, and the reason they don't have patents is because the investors want a company that can get the liquidity in 3 or 4 years instead of 15.
Question over here.
There
you go. I think you got it.
Does it work now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm Paul Morinville with U.S. Inventor. I'm also an inventor. I've got 20-some patents and pending patents that I cannot enforce in the United States. But luckily, I've teamed up with a company, and I've been helping them enforce patents in China. So, or we're working on that, and I've been talking to law firms, Chinese law firms, who claim that they can get all the way through trial in 12 or less months, and 90-some% of the, when you win, 97% of the time they grant an injunction. So you've mentioned Alice is need to be fixed, and PTAB needs to be fixed, and I absolutely agree with you. But I'm wondering what you think of, especially 3M. If a small inventor sues your company, should they get an injunction?
Well, so I think starting at your question about China, yeah. So that, especially I think in the specialized IP courts that they've now formed in Beijing and in Shanghai and in Guangdong, those cases tend to move very quickly, and they're developing their jurisprudence not in the face of an eBay decision or an Alice decision. And so, yes, you can get to judgment, and the success rate for patent owners is very high in those courts. I think there's still work to be done in terms of the remedies, really an effective damages award, and there's issues around the scope of the injunction. As to your other question, in terms of in the U.S., we at 3M and as part of a larger coalition of companies argued the other way on eBay. We argued the way that it didn't come out of the Supreme Court. I think the nature of a property right, like a patent, is exclusivity. It's maybe even a stronger case than for real property because of the limited duration of the patent right. And I think I think the nature of the patent owner, whether it's a small inventor, whether it's a big company, shouldn't matter in terms of enforcement of that patent right. So, yeah, if we got into a situation where it got all the way to a judgment and it went against us. I would expect that 3M would operate under the same rules as any other patent infringement defendant.
Other thoughts? We always thought that China has not really been very respectful of IP rights, copyrights, patents, and all that stuff. Is that changing now as they create more of their own IP? Are we seeing that change? Is that what we're seeing here?
Changing very rapidly.
Yeah, I would completely echo that. The engine that China is creating in terms of the number of new patent applications is stunning. It is absolutely stunning, and it will dwarf the amount of intellectual property elsewhere. Now, the question is, can that be commercialized? That's the question. And here in the United States, our model's being followed elsewhere. And frankly, other countries are scratching their heads into the shooting of the foot in terms of the commercialization of our intellectual property due to patent protection changes. And so that's something that I'm concerned about, that we need to push forward.
Go ahead.
Susie, go ahead.
I just want to echo that. I see China, there's tremendous talent there. There's tremendous talent being brought in to China, and there's tremendous interest and movement in creating a patent system. I think with all due respect, my friends and colleagues in China, there's the protecting of other people's patents is not always the priority. There still is a little bit of a culture of copying is the best form of flattery. So that's another little kind of dark wart on the challenges in China. But just to add to that, I had the honor of going with Ambassador Thorne on his innovation tour of Southeast Asia about a year and a half ago. And we went to Indonesia and we went to Vietnam. And tremendous interest in how the U.S. in the past has done the innovation and kept the patent system going. And so it's not just China and Germany and such who are looking at recreating the model that we have had. It's all of these countries who are very interested in what the good things that the patent system has brought the U.S. and they are definitely not looking to copy some of the problems we have now.
Bob, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, one point that's worth noting, and this is one of the statistics that was developed recently by the National Venture Capital Association. 20 years ago, 90% of all of the venture capital money in the world was spent in the United States on United States companies. Last year it was 54%, and it's declining still. So that's a statistic. Now there's lots of reasons for that, and one of them is the growth of other economies around the world. But a lot of that money is American money that's being invested in China and in Europe and in other places. Right.
Question over here.
Hi, Peter Dio with Harvard University. This is for Steve mostly. So curious of what you've seen, what makes some universities better at or more successful in this enterprise than others? Is it simply a matter of luck in the laboratory, or simply a matter of resources, or are there sort of best practices or policies in place that have made some more successful than others? And then very quickly for the rest of the panel, I know, Steve, you mentioned the declining federal investment in research and the sort of the effects that has downstream. And I'm just assuming that companies like 3M and Qualcomm will immediately fill in the gap when the federal government stops that research. So if you guys just confirm that, that would be great.
I'm behind you, Steve. I'm behind you. I'm shaking my head.
I think that was the easy question. Yeah. But talk about why some universities are better at tech transfer than others, Steve, and what could be factors in that?
Right, and so it's important to realize there's a lot of different factors that go into successful commercialization of inventions. And again, if you think of the funnel, the first thing is, what is the scientific base that you have? Those inventions that are created, that's the raw material that technology transfer offices have to work with. Then it becomes a resource issue. Is that office staffed to the level that they can handle the amount of intellectual property developed? The The second part, and the second or third part of this, would be, what about the patent budget? Again, if we go back to inventions are created, need to be protected and commercialized, those offices that might not have a budget to actually protect that intellectual property are hamstrung from the beginning in ever commercializing that intellectual property downstream. Then upon commercialization, now you have another element of risk, and that is infringement by others, perhaps serial patent challenges. And again, this is a resource-intensive issue. One of the great things about universities is some of that royalty money that comes back to the institution from inventions is then reallocated into that research enterprise and supports the next generation of inventions. So I think some of the universities that stand out reinvest that in the next generation of patent products. There's a lot of education of inventors. So there are a lot of different factors that fit to that. And I'll put a personal plug for Autumn. We do provide a lot of training for those technology transfer offices, such as your colleagues at Harvard.
And just to add to that, if you did a graph of the amount of money invested in research that was going up like this, you could see the number of discoveries in a parallel track. So it's very clear that the more you invest, the more discoveries you're going to create, the more opportunities you're going to have to find the next great drug, the next great technology.
Yep, and actually, I'll give you the number. $2.7 million equals an invention. And again, this is averaged over time, but there's an actual number. So, I mean, that couldn't be more accurate.
Right. Question over here.
Mr. Rhodes, you mentioned that venture capital was perhaps fearful of investing, and you mentioned that the Supreme Court maybe had done some not supported as you would have liked. Can you give an example or two that might help me understand that better?
You mean Mr. Taylor, right here. Yeah.
The question, I think, was to me.
Yeah.
An example of some Supreme Court decisions that I concerned about?
Yeah.
Well, certainly the decision in eBay essentially transformed what the Constitution says is an exclusive right into a non-exclusive right, into a right that other people can use and simply pay damages for. Courts are not issuing injunctions today to companies other than competitors. So if you are a licensing company and someone uses your technology, the best you can do is get some kind of damages or royalty, and that after a major struggle. That's an example. The Section 101 decisions, and there were 4 of them, have made it very difficult to get patent protection, reliable patent protection. Bear in mind that reliability is something that you don't know at the outset. It's something that you have to rely on at the outset, but are not going to find out how enforceable your rights are until you have to go to court to use them, or have discussions with other parties. And with the loss with the rulings in Bilski, Myriad Genetics, the Alice case, and there's one other one,
Mayo.
And Mayo. Those cases have just wreaked havoc with software industries and life science industries, particularly on the diagnostic side, and the protection of genetic discoveries. Myriad was decided 30 years after the patents issued on the BRCA1 gene that was the subject of that litigation. And it had long since gone off a patent. There were other follow-on sequence patents, but we had 30 years of capital formation built around the notion that we can get patents on gene sequences if they're isolated and discovered. And suddenly all of that evaporated. That's what I'm talking about.
Thank you.
Do others want to jump in on that? Any other additional comments there? We have about 5 or 10 minutes left, so if anybody has other questions or comments, please come to the microphone. I see someone right over here. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Patrick Kilbride with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Let me go back to a comment that Mr. Rhodes made about patent opposition. I think, supporters of the current system would have us believe that its intention is to clear the underbrush, I think is the term that's been used, of low-quality patents. But your comments suggested that, in fact, it's the most useful and attractive patents that are being targeted there. Can you comment further, or others?
Yeah, I think the statistics say that something like 80% of the patents involved in IPR are involved in concurrent district court litigation. And that makes sense. I mean, given the cost of these proceedings, it's not like European oppositions, which are very low cost and are used sort of as a way to help guide R&D efforts and to kind of clearance for development. These are really typically, given the investment required, part and parcel of litigation. So as a result, I mean, I look at the patents that we've had involved in IPR. These are patents that we are enforcing and then have drawn an IPR. And I think that's overwhelmingly true. These are not a random sampling of patents coming out of the patent office. These are ones that someone has thought were important enough to try to use, and someone else has thought were important enough to try to enforce. And so I think the fact that we are seeing, institution rates that I think are now about 70%, and once the institution is granted, you're overwhelmingly likely to lose some or all of your claims in the IPR. And there's the issue of the serial challenges that Steve just referenced. I mean, this really does, cast this air of uncertainty, unreliability, and a lack of quiet title over these most important patents that you want to use to secure investments in manufacturing and jobs, to commercialize the invention. And so, I think that is a byproduct of not necessarily the original conception of what an IPR would look like. I guess the Oil States case that'll be decided by the Supreme Court next term on the constitutionality of the procedure on its face will tell us more about that. But I do think, in particular, the way the system has been implemented through the rulemaking process sort of deviated from the original conception that these would be low cost, quick, and in front of expert judges as an alternative to litigation. They're now becoming, an adjunct onto litigation and are drawing these serial challenges. So you look at these, one final point on this, you look at this institution rate, and we read it's like 70%. But some of the most valuable patents, and especially in the life sciences sector where they're extremely valuable, draw multiple challenges. So if you have one patent and you get 5 challenges to it, and you win the first 4 and you lose the last one, according to the PTO stats, there's only a 20% institution rate for that patent, right? For the patent owner's perspective, it's 100%. Your patent is now subject to a proceeding, and the odds are very long against you that it's going to survive. So I think that's the nature of this sort of lack of reliability and quiet title in patent rights. And it makes for extremely difficult discussions. Susie might have something to add on this. Extremely difficult discussions with business leadership in determining where to invest in these commercialization efforts that we would hope would be secured by patent rights.
Anybody else have a comment on that?
Maybe I'll just echo a little bit just in talking about property rights. And, the way I sometimes think about it is patents are property rights. And so what's another property right but, a deed to a piece of land. You purchase a piece of land. You have a deed to that. It says that's your land. No one else can go on your land. You decide to build a 2-story colonial. Costs you a lot of money. You finally put that up. And then the next day, someone says, that's actually my land. You don't actually own that land. Well, is that person ever going to build another house on another piece of property? Will that company ever invest in the resources necessary to develop that next invention? That's really what panics me going forward.
Steve, since you're talking, one of the probably the most important beginning, the beginning of tech transfer was the Bayh-Dole Act that passed in 1980 that allowed universities and the inventor to take title of the patent as opposed to the government having it, and things just never got out the door. And all of a sudden this boom happened. we're starting to see now people saying, well, wait a minute, Bayh-Dole, you know, doesn't that make people pay twice? They pay for the research and they got to buy the product. And what are we getting out of it? We, the taxpayer, we, the consumers. How do you respond to that? How do you think Bayh-Dole continues to be relevant here in the 21st century?
Sure. So, you know, probably back to imitation is the best form of flattery. There are Bayh-Dole Act legislations being passed around the globe. So the effect of Bayh-Dole on our economy, and I talked about the numbers and jobs, is already clear. But let's get specifically to your question. Hey, you're a taxpayer. Why invest? Why have the Bayh-Dole Act? You're paying twice. So I'll give two quick answers. Number one, I was a taxpayer before. Well, maybe I wasn't, but others were a taxpayer before 1980. You were not getting any benefit out of your tax money. That tax money was going to universities for research, inventions were being developed, and that was it. So number one, you just had a big, you know, ran into a brick wall. That's number one. Number two, now when those inventions are developed, those property rights are maintained by the institution with a perpetual license to the government. So it's not that it's completely in the university, but so now it's in the university, and now it needs to be commercialized. So you talk about the pay twice. Benjamin Franklin said inspiration or inventions are 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And I actually think that is a great example of inventions. Inventions are developed at universities, maybe with some NIH grant funding, totals $5, $10, $20 million, our money, a portion of our money. However, a drug does not take $20 million to develop. That's going to be $2.6 billion. You got your 99% to 1%. So I would say the Bayh-Dole Act has been extremely successful. You could see it throughout the world. And in the absence of the Bayh-Dole Act, certain intellectual property will never have been developed. You think that there's a tree that just grows drugs, and you could just pluck it off and you know, it's easy as that. So anybody have any idea how many FDA-approved drugs or drugs are approved by the FDA every year?
40.
On the high end. 40 on the high end. 18 on the low end. So that is currently in our system over the past period of time. There have been as few as 18 new drugs developed. As you reduce the incentive to develop additional drugs going forward, that's going down, down, down. So those are the types of concerns I have. So I'd say the Bayh-Dole Act has been a huge success, imitated by others, and is the best engine for pushing our university intellectual property forward into the commercial sphere.
Bob, we have a question for Steve.
Fire away.
I've worked with about, in the last couple of years, at least half a dozen, maybe more universities. They all have different policies regarding the ability of their professors to start companies and commercialize the technology that the professor worked on with post-grad students to develop. And is my just my anecdotal experience is that universities like Stanford, which encourage their professors to start companies, seem to have a more robust pipeline of companies coming out than some of the universities that really won't even allow their professors to become part of a new company. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so there are a lot of pieces to that as well. Number one, individual policies at universities may be more or less concerned about implied conflict of interest. So you can imagine the issues that arise where a professor has a company, has equity stake in a company, and perhaps has their postdoc developing, furthering that invention. So you could see there's some apparent conflicts. And so those are managed well, but you've got to be careful with that. So sometimes there's just a moratorium on that. I think universities are moving away from that. I think more and more universities are recognizing the importance of having that inventor involved in a company. That being said, that inventor is generally not going to be the CEO of that company going forward. Now, they're a key element. They are the scientific brains behind that. But bringing in an entrepreneur is the next important stage. And to do that, you need to have strong patent rights that will attract funding that will allow the hiring of an entrepreneur.
So as we close this panel, just a quick comment, Susie. I was intrigued that with your students' activities, you had one of the choices for a career was political scientist, and I think given what we've seen in Washington the last 6 months, I think that phrase political science might be an oxymoron. But anyway, I want to thank our panel very much for being here today. I think what they have showed us, again, something I think we all appreciate is the value of patents, and how patents are going to be handled is going to say a lot about where we're going to be as a country in the next 10, 20 years. And I think you've heard some interesting perspectives on that as we wrestle with these issues in the future. So please join me in thanking our panel here today.
Holly Fechner will moderate our next panel, Unlocking U.S. Economic Opportunity by Promoting Diversity in Invention, Access to Capital, and Patenting. Holly is a partner here at Covington & Burling, where she works on patent issues and government affairs. She is also the chair of the board of directors of the Institute of Women's Policy Research, which conducts women-centered, policy-oriented research. And prior to coming to Covington, Holly held several distinguished positions, notably as policy director for Senator Ted Kennedy and as an attorney for the National Partnership for Women and Families. Please give Holly a warm welcome, and please return to your seat so we can go ahead and start our next discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lori, and welcome to everybody to the Inventing America Conference. What a terrific first panel, and I think what we'll be talking about now will really build on that panel. It is really an honor to be here with such a distinguished group of speakers on this panel, but also with this amazing audience. We've got so many people here today who play such critical roles in the innovation ecosystem. So what we want to do today is talk about another very important issue related to diversity in invention, access to capital, and the patenting system. And part of the reason that we think this is so important builds on the work of the first panel. You heard from the panelists about the critical importance of invention and patenting to growing our economy and keeping it strong. This group of panelists have all done very important groundbreaking work related to diversity in those issues, in invention and patenting. And part of what they've done is they've identified gaps, important patenting gaps related to different demographic characteristics of people across the economy. And we're going to learn more about those gaps today from our speakers. And I think what that really leads to, an important lesson, is thinking about kinds of changes we can make to help unlock that economic potential. So that's, I think, one of the critical takeaways. What I'd like to do now is to introduce our four speakers. And then we'll have a moderated discussion. Please be thinking about what you'd like to ask them, because we'll certainly have time for your questions as we move forward. So first, I'd like to introduce right immediately to my right, Dr. Barbara Gault. And she is the Vice President and Executive Director for the Institute for Women's Policy Research, which is a nonpartisan think tank based here in Washington, D.C. Barbara's work focuses on policies to promote access to post-secondary education and early care, improve job quality for low-wage workers, and employment equity. And for our purposes today, Barbara led a team that produced a report entitled Equity in Innovation, Women, Inventors, and Patents. And she will explain her findings today. She earned her PhD in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania and her BA from the University of Michigan. Go Blue. And with the Michigan theme here, Dr. Lisa Cook at the far end is Associate Professor of Economics and International Relations at Michigan State University. Lisa was previously on the faculty of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, a National Fellow at Stanford University, a Senior Advisor on Finance and Development at the U.S. Department of Treasury, and she also worked for the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 2011 to 2012. Her current research interests include economic growth and development, innovation, and financial institutions and markets. She earned her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley with BAs from Spelman and Oxford. So we welcome Dr. Cook. Erin Kelly, we welcome her, is co-director of the STEM to Market program, the AWIS Accelerator at the Association for Women in Science. Her career has focused on diversity in business and entrepreneurship ecosystems. She previously worked for the National Women's Business Council, where she served as Director of Research and Policy, overseeing a portfolio to further understand how policy can support the success of women entrepreneurs. She earned her master's degree in international relations from Johns Hopkins University, her MBA from the University of Virginia, and her undergraduate degree from Mount Holyoke College. Welcome. And our final speaker is Alex Bell, soon to be probably Dr. Bell, who is a student at the Harvard Economics Department, studying inequality and innovation. He's a fellow in the multi-interdisciplinary program in inequality and social policy at the Weatherhead Initiative on Gender Inequality, as well as a former National Bureau of Economic Research Health and Aging Research Fellow. He's the author of one of the important recent papers in this field called The Life Cycle of Inventors. Alex received a BS with honors in computer science and economics from Brown University. So we welcome all of our panelists today. First, I thought we would start out by trying to lay some kind of groundwork for the important researchers that the academics on our panel have participated in and written about and shared. And this is all very recent work, but what I'd like to do now is first, Barbara, how about if we turn to you to hear more about the research that you and your colleagues at IWPR have done on women inventors and patenting.
Sure, thanks. And it's wonderful to be here with you today. We did a report last year with funding from Qualcomm that compiled what we know about what is the proportion of women who are patenting and what does the research say about why women are underrepresented in patenting. So what we found is that women are about 18.8% of patent holders. So they are listed on 18.8% of patents. So there's at least one woman. So that doesn't mean they're 18.8% of patent holders. It means that there's at least one woman listed on 18.8% of patents. So that's pretty low. There's a lot of difference in terms of the kinds of patents that men and women get. We did a projection where we tried to look at this rate of progress, when will we see parity in patenting? And we found that at the current rate, women would be patenting at the same rate as men in the year 2092. There was an interesting new report that we're going to add to our compilation that just came out at the end of 2016 from WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, that did the same thing but on the international scale. So they looked at, of all the patent applicants, how many of them are female, and they found that 29.9% of patent applications have at least one woman listed internationally, which is a little bit better. And their data is a little bit more recent. I mean, one of the issues that we've had is that it's very hard to study gender in patenting because we don't have gender information from patent and trade offices, either in the US or internationally. So WIPO also did a projection and found that women would reach parity in the year 2080. So I have a little picture of a flying car on my slide here because that's kind of the time frame that we're looking at. Hopefully by that point we will have flying cars, and maybe a woman will have invented one. But obviously the progress is too slow. And why should we care? I mean, does that really matter? I think it matters for a lot of reasons. I think we can't really have a strong economy when half the population or close to it is kind of keeping their ideas under a rock. So I think to get a really thriving innovation infrastructure, we've got to get everyone at the table. So next slide. This is also from the WIPO report, and it shows how different countries are doing in terms of the share of women that are inventing. And here you can see that there's huge international variation in the proportion of women that are inventing, which to me has a couple of implications. Like if you look at China, Korea, and Singapore, they're doing much better than most other countries in terms of integrating women into the patenting process. Are they doing this just to be nice? Are they doing this, for social justice purposes? Probably not. It's probably for economic reasons. And then you can see on the other end, I just put the worst performers up here internationally as well. The US falls about in the middle. Now, part of the story is that these countries have different industries that they tend to patent in. But when you look at China, Korea, and Singapore, they have more participation of women across all industries. And yes, it's dominated by telecom, and we've seen a lot of progress in terms of women's patenting in telecom. But across the board, they've done something better to integrate women. So I feel like this report is really important because it provides us some clues, or at least some places to look as to how are these countries doing it. The next slide looks at this same WIPO report analyzes women's participation by different fields of study or fields of employment. And we see that biotech and pharmaceuticals, organic chemistry and food chemistry have high participation of women as patent applicants. And we also know that in the field of STEM overall, that those are the areas where women have been better integrated. And the worst performing fields tend to be mechanical engineering, essentially. So I think it's very important for us to focus on the fields that aren't integrating women well. I mean, that's a part of the story, a big part of the story, but it's also not all of the story. This report also finds that in academia, women are much more likely to patent as a share of all patent applicants than they are in business. For example, business files many more patents internationally, but women are much less represented in business. So for us as researchers, this is fantastic because it allows us to see, okay, what is academia doing? Is it the tech transfer offices that are encouraging women in a way that's working well? How much of it has to do with the fields that they're patenting in versus the help they're providing in terms of economic support, in terms of information, in terms of encouragement or creating peer groups and networks. So we're going to be continuing to explore what models seem to be working out there. And another just interesting side note on this WIPO report is that they actually have information company by company on the proportion of women that are listed on patent applicants. And certain companies have seen a lot of progress. And I will call out Qualcomm because among US companies, it's definitely in the top few in terms of women's participation. And the amount of progress has been tremendous. So it would be great to hear from you all about how you did that. And to try to take those lessons and to share them and to scale them across the country as a whole so that we have more ideas contributing to the economy. And I think there's something that we all can do to make a difference. I was trying to think about, well, why do the people in this room care about this issue particularly? Why should you care? I mean, just think about it. If women were half of patent applicants, I mean, if you're a patent attorney, your client base would change entirely. Like, what if you were required to have half of your clients be female? Like, what would you do? It would change the way you do outreach and the way you recruit clients 100%. I mean, I think we're so used to the world as it is that it's hard for us to envision just how different it would be if we actually truly had an inclusive innovation economy.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And let's turn to Lisa, because she really has done some of the groundbreaking work related to race and gender in patenting. Lisa?
So thank you so much for having me here, and thank you so much for this discussion. I think that, if we go to the next slide, I look at this in stages. There is participation at each stage that's critical for the innovation process. So it's invention, participating in the invention preparation phase and the innovation phase, which is the commercialization phase, and I'd like to talk about the two. Next slide. So in terms of preparation for participation in invention, I'm most interested in, and my research is most interested in, those who are getting higher level degrees in science and engineering, and who's preparing to participate in the science and engineering workforce. So this graph shows you how that has changed over time for women. So this is 1966, when 9% of women had PhDs in S&E fields, and by the end of this period, it's 42%. Next slide. For African Americans, there has been an increase as well. Certainly, it's starting from an even lower base, and it's flatter, but still increasing. There's been a lot more movement with respect to master's degrees, for example. Most of the people participating in invention and innovation are at the bachelor's degree level. My research is focusing on a specific group, but this is the upper bound. So there's much more activity with respect to bachelor's degrees, and I'll say a bit more about that in just a moment. Next slide. So that's with respect to invention. So there's a gap with respect to invention, but that's not all the story. There's some with respect to innovation, and I'm saying innovation is just commercializing invention. So the invention gap looks like this. For all US inventors, there are roughly 235 patents per million. For women, there are about 40 patents per million. This is the population of women. So for African Americans, this is 6 patents per million. So in general, there are fewer African American and women, fewer African Americans and women participating in the innovation economy, commercializing invention, and in the innovation process. So let's go to the next slide. So if we're looking at S&E occupations, this is the breakdown. So the majority of those participating in S&E occupations in 2015 would be white men, about 50%, about half. White women, 18%. African American women, 2%, and African American men, 3%. So this doesn't quite line up with especially bachelor's degrees. So that's a majority of people who are obtaining degrees in S&E and science and engineering, and those who are participating in invention and innovation. Next slide. So what's the opportunity cost? So Barbara was talking about why we should care. So I'm an economist. I am thinking about the opportunity costs associated with not including women and African Americans. So how do I think about that? I think about it with respect to missing discoveries and missing GDP. So first, we found in my first paper on the topic in 2011 that mixed patent teams, so co-ed patent teams, are more productive than either single-sex female teams or single-sex male teams. So if that's the case, you would expect there to be, over time, much more integration of patent teams, but that hasn't happened. Hunt et al. In 2012 came up with a calculation that we thought was quite interesting, and what they found was that the underrepresentation of women in S&E fields makes it lower, GDP lower, the calculation of GDP lower than it would be otherwise. So it would be 2.7% higher per capita if there weren't this gap in patenting. We did a similar calculation. They used bachelor's degrees, we used PhD degrees, and ours is a minimum. So what I'm giving you is the most conservative estimate. What we did was we looked at PhDs, and what we suggested is that this is anywhere between 0.64% higher. It would be 0.46 higher, 0.46. Okay, let me start that again. A little under 1% higher to 3.3% higher if women and African Americans were included, and this is the lower bound. I'm being extremely conservative in my estimate. So what are the possible policy responses? So I don't think just about how government might intervene. Typically, that's how we think about policy implications. But I first think about firms. And the data sets I'm using in the survey of doctoral recipients from the NSF, most of the people who are PhD holders are in industry. So my question is what industry can do. Women are most productive at firms that are large, and they're medium range, but particularly at large firms. So the question is what's happening in the other firms. So not the smallest firms and not the largest firms, but in the middle. So I think that there are inclusive policies that could be implemented in those firms as well. This used to be the case at AT&T, when AT&T used to have a very generous and long-standing program to support women and minority PhD candidates. We can also look to government. So NSF and NIH have two different approaches to inclusion. NIH has gone through a very thorough review of who obtains NIH funding, and it found that women and minorities were less likely to get NIH funding, and they've implemented changes to address that. In a certain sense, doing more blind type work, being more inclusive in their panels, so they're closing that gap. NSF has not done that, and I think it is worth doing. There are two kinds of inequality that arise from that. It doesn't have to do with just gender and race, but also with respect to elite institutions. So you might not be getting the kinds of discoveries that would push GDP forward, that would push the economy forward, with there being so much munching at elite universities. Universities could do a lot more. I am the co-director of the American Economic Association summer program, and what we say and what we've heard and what a lot of evidence suggests is that you can't be what you can't see. And in universities, I think it's critical to have, in all the fields we're talking about, especially where science and engineering participation is falling, say in computer science, to make sure that faculties are putting in front of students those who look like the students rather than those who look like the people who are on the faculty. So I am offering a modest suggestion, and I look forward to the conversation about it.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Lisa. In the paper that Alex and his colleagues produced, they focused on some additional factors, different demographic factors that influence this patent gap. Alex, we'd love to hear more about your work.
Thanks, Holly. So the slides that I'm going to show you, is this on? Yeah. The slides that I'm going to show you come from a linkage that I did of U.S. patent and trademark records to the tax data. This is very useful because it allows us to see a lot about who are the people that are becoming inventors and who are the people that are not becoming inventors. So the first slide that I have here is on the x-axis, I've plotted the parents' household income percentile. And so this would be the parents' income during the kid's childhood. And what I have on the y-axis is the outcome of the likelihood that the kid becomes an inventor. Inventor is defined as filing a patent at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And what we see here is that kids who are born to parents in the, let's say, the top 1% of income are about 10 times more likely to become an inventor than kids who are born to parents below the median income. This is a very stark contrast. It's suggestive of a potential misallocation of talent unless you really believe that kids who are born to lower income parents are sort of much less able to be inventors. So let's take a look at the next slide. This is what I investigate. So we link the tax records also to a measure of early childhood aptitude. So we have test scores in 3rd grade, which are actually surprisingly predictive of becoming an inventor, especially the math test scores. And the 2 lines that I've drawn here, the red line is for kids from parents from wealthier parents, and the blue line is kids from poorer parents. Again, we have the y-axis is the likelihood of becoming an inventor. And what we see here is that conditional on being very high ability, say having test scores that are more than 2 standard deviations above the mean, it's the kids from the richer parents that are actually more likely to become inventors. So here, this, I think, really speaks even more to a misallocation of talent, that we clearly have very high ability kids who are not becoming inventors simply because of the sort of socioeconomic status that they were born into. What I've described so far is it's sort of speaking to the role of birth in the invention process. So the family that you're born into and the socioeconomic status that you're born into seems to matter. Let's take a look at the next slide, which is speaking more toward the exposure component of invention. What I have here is a map of the United States, and the coloring is showing the number of inventors who are, the number of kids who are born in this area, how many of those kids become an inventor. So this is not showing you a map of where do inventors live today, but this is showing you a map of where are inventors born. And what you see here is that there are some hotspots of innovation around New England, certainly the Lakes area, Midwest, also around California and the Bay Area. What's interesting about this map is that the places that are good at producing kids who become inventors are actually the places that have a lot of adult innovation going on. And what's striking about that to me is that's true even within technology category. So what I mean by that is that we see the Bay Area and the Great Lakes area have a lot of inventors, but in fact, if you ask where are computer inventors most likely to be born, the answer is going to be in the Bay Area around other computer inventors. And if you ask similarly where are sort of the drug and medical device inventors going to be born, again, the answer is near the Mayo Clinic, where there's a lot of sort of drug and medical innovation going on during their childhood. So the conclusion of all this, and I'll save the rest of the slides for questions if we need to, but the conclusion is that when we look at where do inventors come from today, there seems to be a strong role of birth and sort of socioeconomic status predicting who becomes an inventor, but there's also a role of exposure, which might be potentially more malleable through things like mentorship. It seems like people who come into contact with inventors are much more likely to be inventors themselves in that particular subject area.
Thank you so much, Alex. Aaron, let's turn to you. You've really spent your career working on diversity and entrepreneurship and innovation. How do you see this patenting gap playing out in practice? What do you see happening, and what kind of programs have you been involved with to address it?
So the project that I'm working on right now is very interesting because the STEM to Market Accelerator is focusing specifically on women who are interested in commercializing their research, whether that's actually building a company based on commercializing that product or licensing it to another company. And then we're pairing that with an investor mentor program. So investors get to mentor the women participating in the accelerator but then also the investors receive training on gender bias and rules or tools and accountability that they can bring back to their firms so that they can really take a hard look at how decisions are being made around the founders that they're encountering. And so the bidirectional mentoring is that the investor gets to learn from the entrepreneur what it's been like to come through, receive STEM training through university and deal with that culture, as well as encountering the tech and entrepreneurship culture, which both are have significant barriers for women and other underrepresented minorities. So we believe that this approach will allow us to reach influencers and spread some information about how we can do better around encountering women founders and other underrepresented founders.
It seems like a lot of people who look at these issues think, well, if only we had more women and people of color getting STEM degrees, for example, we could really make a dent in this problem. But I think one of the things you've all noticed, and people who look at this more closely see, that there are so many steps along the way that have some influence in determining who ends up inventing and patenting. And I'd love to hear more from any of you who want to jump in about those various different stages along the way and what you see from your work.
So I think there's a lot of opportunity in terms of policy. We see there are individuals who, we know from the research that it's not just that particular founder. There's systematic biases and barriers that are preventing us to achieve our full potential. So we've touched on the mentoring topic before. Mentoring serves as a very important exposure to people who are doing commercial science, and they provide role modelship, which we also spoke about before. So mentoring programs, formal mentoring programs, are really important, but you can't just lay a mentoring program onto an academic environment where the underlying biases are still there. So there's very specific things that need to happen in a mentoring program in order to make it successful. So mentors need to be taught. Mentors need to be trained about how to be a good mentor, and that includes the social skills and ethical practices that they need to really be a good mentor to their protege. We also know that mentoring is not really a part of the tenure and promotion decisions. And so when senior faculty, they don't really have strong incentives to mentor junior faculty women and introduce them to the world that is commercial science. And so there's, in the past, there's been this cultural feeling in scientific academia that for-profit companies are not the best way to get our research out there. And you can look at it in other ways. Well, it is, because then we are creating something that people will buy, and more people will buy it, and we're creating value for everyone. So a lot of women scientists haven't really heard or internalized that message. And so it's not a pathway that is typically talked about. So these mentorship programs that are talking specifically about commercial science can help women postdocs and women doing research in an academic environment go down the route of commercial science and start patenting. So supporting mentoring at an institutional level with very formal training and incentives tying into hiring and decision making is really important, because mentors can also help women access formal networks and develop informal networks as well. So we've seen from the research that it is more difficult for women to access these networks. And so specifically cross-sex mentoring is a really important component because men tend to have more access to those more resource and more powerful networks.
So I think this is a really good question, Holly. Even though I'm focusing on STEM fields, I would argue that a big part of the problem is that a lot of the innovation doesn't come from STEM. A lot of the people who are innovating are not STEM people. So when I talk about you can't be what you can't see, a lot of people point to my friend Sheryl Sandberg, with whom I worked at the Treasury Department. And Sheryl was working with me at the Treasury Department. Again, she came through government and she's not a scientist. And I think that if you're talking about creating successful companies and having role models as such, what typically happens to women is that they're judged by a different standard. So a different standard with respect to publication. So what we found recently is that women who published in Econometrica, one of our leading journals, were published 6 months later, all else equal, 6 months later than their male counterparts. So from acceptance to publication 6 months later, which feeds into this other problem of not getting tenure, not having the safety and security to be able to engage in commercial activities like their counterparts. So there are many things along the way. The other thing might be, not just with respect to STEM fields, but that maybe people don't know the data. So every time I'm in Silicon Valley, every October, I'm interviewing people related to my research. I tell them about this finding about the productivity of patent teams. So co-ed teams being more productive than single-sex teams. And everybody's mouth just drops. Like, you're kidding. How can that be? And, I'm thinking that a lot of people don't have this information. So maybe there needs to be greater flow between academia and the rest of the world to be able to change these policies.
Alex?
Yeah, I wanted to mention one thing that's related to Erin's comment about sort of the role of gender in mentoring. And I had shown that slide that was explaining that kids who are growing up around inventors are more likely to be inventors themselves. I wanted to point out that that's also true sort of within gender. So if you look at where are the girls likely to become inventors, girls in which neighborhood are most likely to become inventors, and you look at the adult men and adult women in their neighborhood, it turns out the number of adult men doesn't matter when you condition on the number of adult women. And then it's swapped for boys also. So young boys are growing up in places where there are a lot of adult men inventing, and conditional on that, the number of adult women doesn't seem to matter. And economically, this seems to be a pretty large effect. So if you took that correlation as causal, and you thought that girls were inventing more in some places because there were more female inventors, and that was really the sort of causal mechanism, then if you created a world in which the number of adult women inventors was the same as the number of adult male inventors, you would essentially almost close the gender gap among young boys and young girls for invention. So I get the sense from that line of research that the role of gender is very important in mentoring, in mentoring, yeah.
Yeah, just another thing to add to this idea around mentoring is there was a recent study out of the Small Business Association that looked at a survey of post-secondary faculty and looked at factors associated with patenting. And the things that predicted patenting were much different for men and women. So for women, having a postdoc was positively correlated with later patenting. Whereas for men, it didn't seem to make a difference, which to me supports that. There were some other interesting things in there. For women, having a small child makes a big difference, whereas for men, it makes no difference. So, you're looking at, traditional gender roles or the distribution of labor within the home, that sort of thing. What are we really going to do about that? But it does point to the need for childcare supports or work-life benefits in academia and outside as well.
And Barbara, what about access to venture capital? I know your report looked at that issue.
Yeah. There's a very interesting study that was written up in the Harvard Business Review recently out of Sweden, where some researchers tape-recorded conversations between venture capitalists and men and women who are applying for venture capital. They do that through the government in Sweden. And they did a qualitative analysis of how the potential investors responded to the applicants. And there were big differences depending on the gender of the applicant. So, and it was interesting, the same qualities were interpreted differently for men and women. So being young, for example, was a negative for women and a positive for men. So for women, it was they're young and they're inexperienced and they don't know what they don't have enough expertise. For men, they're young, they're promising, they're energetic. There were a whole list of qualities like that seemed to flip when it was a woman. And there you're looking at implicit bias or unconscious bias, which I think is a really tough nut to crack. I mean, we all have it. And can you just be conscious of it and get rid of it that way? There's some evidence to suggest it doesn't work like that. So it has to be more of an issue of creating enforcement, creating incentives. And that's where, I think people are starting to really question the Wild West nature of Silicon Valley startups and with respect to kind of a lack of traditional human resource policies. I think a lot of what HR policies do, if they're done well, is help you avoid that kind of bias by having clear processes for hiring, for promotion, et cetera. So I think that we're going to see that changing over time. I mean, we've seen this disaster at Uber, for example, because of just kind of a lack of respect for traditional HR practices that have been accepted throughout the rest of the business world.
And to build on that as well, it's very typical for people to have homogenous networks. So they're connected mostly to people who are relatively speaking like them. And what that means is you find people to be on your founding team or your first employees that are like you. So that maybe they're from your alma mater, or maybe you went to school or are from the same place. And so that is one thing that prevents more diversity among founders in this space, is that we haven't built heterogeneous networks, and so it's more difficult to find the people that aren't like you, but those people also can bring so much value because they're thinking differently from you.
I'd love to hear from our panelists what role you think the government can play. Are there particular policies that the government should be promoting? What role does the private sector have? Are there particular best practices that we've learned about? This mixed gender teams is a fascinating insight into something that has been shown to make a difference. What about universities? Are there certain things? Are there best practices? We've seen that the whole tenure process has implications for this. What are some ideas that you'd all offer about policies for dealing with this issue?
So as a person who's recently served as a chair of a promotion and tenure committee, I think there's a lot that could be done. I think that there is a lot of fertilization that happens between universities and firms, and that requires flexibility, the kind of flexibility that we've been alluding to here. So if there's something broken before the promotion and tenure process, that means that afterwards, where there is more protection for individuals to engage in commercialization and go between firms and the university, we're not going to see the end product. So I think that there has to be better mentoring, number one. There have to be people who are hired first. I mean, I have served on hiring committees all the time, and the social network part is a big part. So who do you know who can be effective in this role? Who's being mentored in formal and informal ways? And I would argue that informal mentoring is even more powerful than formal mentoring. I think some of the social networks that form early on, study groups. So study groups that become patent teams or become authorship teams. And what we find in economics is that most articles are co-authored these days. I mean, the increase in the number of co-authored articles has gone up exponentially over the last even 10 years. So there is a lot of coming together, a lot of collaboration that has to happen. So the better we understand how this collaboration forms, I think the more targeted our efforts can be. And that's true for universities, that's true for patent teams, that's true for firms.
Anybody else want to take that on?
Yeah, returning to the collection of data that we've talked about, we don't have a lot in terms of doing research on who is applying, who is patenting. A lot of that work comes from matching names of patent holders with known databases of, well, we predict Jessica is a woman and Michael is a man. Because the USPTO is in talks to collect that kind of data, but they haven't yet. And so it's difficult to get a really close-in assessment of what exactly is going on in terms of who is applying, who is actually receiving the patent, and then furthermore, what's going on with that patent once it's been granted. Does it get commercialized? Like, does that actually go to market, or does it sit? Because that happens all the time as well. We also, I think we discussed a little bit before, the data collection and transparency from NIH, from NSF, and the SBIR, STTR programs. Again, that's not really well understood. It's a little bit of a black box, and it's getting better, and different agencies are doing work around that. But the more that we can press those agencies to release that information and their policies around outreach to these different groups would be very helpful in terms of measuring where we're at and how we can improve. There used to be in the SBIR program a specialized SBIR program that focused on bringing underrepresented entrepreneurs money. Now, that program was not used well and was discontinued in the 90s, but I think it's worth looking at again, given the available funding that is there. And it can be structured differently, but if we have ways to identify strong PIs and founders that might otherwise be overlooked, it could be an interesting tool to look at.
Erin raises this very interesting point, which I was not aware of until I started looking more closely into this area, which is the data is very hard to access. I guess I had assumed that the government collected this data in a way that would be easy for researchers to access. As Erin points out, this isn't the case, and these academics here have done truly backflips to figure out ways to access this data. So I'd love to hear more from them about the data challenges and recommendations for dealing with that.
Yeah, I mean, when we started working on this, we were a bit aghast that people were using name matching software to figure out both race and gender. And imagine it at the international level, too. That's how that WIPO study with something like 8 million inventors across 152 countries was done. They had software that matched names to gender. So, just asking that question on the forums would be super helpful. And I don't know that there are serious reasons that we can't do that anymore. I think, historically it might have been a concern about bias among the patent examiners, but we know now that there appears to be very little bias in terms of how many of women or race and gender differences in terms of the acceptance or the approval of patents. So that's one thing. And then we learned that there are some surveys that in the past historically had collected data about patenting, but they've stopped, I suppose due to a lack of interest among researchers or a lack of, I think we can make it known that we would like the National Survey of College Graduates to go back to asking about patenting, or the National Survey of Earned Doctorates to include that question. I mean, it's always a challenge because these surveys get so long, they're always looking for something to cut. But I think as a community, we can let them know that, hey, this is very important information for our economy and allows us to see how we're progressing. So, you know, we're unfortunately stuck using extremely old data much of the time right now.
The one thing I would add to that also, you know, in addition to the USPTO collecting information, one thing I've been pretty happy to see is that there's been a good amount of sharing of information, at least among academics. And I know one of the early uses of the patent data among academics was like a disambiguation. So people want to know how many patents did each person have, because in the USPTO data, you can't really link people across patents in a systematic way. And that was sort of an endeavor that got shared pretty widely. But I know that there are also these sort of like private commercialized data sets that maybe aren't really shared between the commercial sector and academics. So I think I'd like to see sort of even more sharing of data that has been cleaned and is accessible now.
Well, there's a slight problem with that in that the commercial software exists for a reason, and sharing typically means paying a license fee. And I think that there ought to be, either we ought to be given more access to their data, or they should be more willing to work with us. I think that might be the thing. I think we have to be careful about citation. Well, we have to be careful about collecting data from the USPTO. I personally don't want the USPTO collecting these data for the reason that I mentioned about NIH and NSF grants, because I think that does introduce bias. And what we haven't done systematically is to figure out whether there are these patent examiner effects on having this information. We know from so many different realms that it changes the way people see the applicant, so I wouldn't expect this to be different. There's so few of them that I think that it might be highlighted, so I'd be worried about that. I would be more enthusiastic about merging data sets, census data sets, other ones that would help identify people otherwise. I would also be careful there, because if you're talking about small numbers of people, say Hispanics and African Americans, that can have another effect of exposing privacy. So I think we have to go forward, but with privacy concerns in mind. I think another thing that can be done with the NSF survey of earned doctorates, which is the survey that I use, they ask every year about patents. They don't always ask about patents that have been commercialized and firms that result from these patents. And I think that that's where the systematic mistake is being made. So there's a conversation there happening now at NSF, and we're participating, my co-authors and I are participating in that conversation to try to make sure that these questions are asked systematically, and we can build a time series to see what happens to graduate students, well, to students, to graduate students, to professors who go through this path, or people who wind up in industry, who go through this system, and how they contribute at every single stage.
Mm-hmm. I think, Lisa, you raised an interesting point. Certainly the issue of introducing bias would be a real concern. I know in a number of areas related to government collection of data, we collect it, but separate that from any decision making about whatever the applicant is applying for. So it would be worth looking at those models to see how they're working. I want to open it up in just a couple minutes for people's questions, so please be thinking of that. And we've got microphones here. But as we've seen, the different researchers here have identified different kinds of gaps, and we can think about what impact they have on the system in terms of what inventions are created, what that means for the economy, what that means for our country vis-a-vis other countries. There's a lot of ways to look at it. I'm interested for all of you in what are your next research interests in this area? What else would you like to look at that you either are planning to now, or in your dream scenario you'd like to, or you'd like someone else to look at? Are there other type gaps? What are your research agendas moving forward? Alex, you want to start?
Sure. So I think that one thing that I'm very excited to research next, which was also sort of related to a question earlier on, is not just what's the gap in invention by gender or by race or by SES, but what is the gap in the sort of pipeline leading up to there? And how do you see that sort of emerging throughout the childhood and young adulthood and the college years, grad school, things like that? So I think something that should be high on the agenda is better understanding how that whole pipeline diverges for people of different sort of categories.
Mm-hmm. There's one paper that I have been working on for about 15 years that has been tricky to try to address, and I think it is now related to Alex's and Raj's research, and that's that I find that the thing that is most predictive of being productive in patenting in the DC, Virginia, Maryland area is how close people live to a Whole Foods. So I don't know what's going on in Whole Foods around here, but I think it again has to do with social networks, who you're running into. So what I find is that if you live in a more segregated zip code, so I was doing this by zip code when I was doing it, you would probably be on a patent team of one, and you'd probably be African American, and that's still true. For others who live within some small distance of Whole Foods, you're more likely to be on a patent team with a lot more people, and you're likely to live in a not predominantly African American neighborhood. So I set that aside because that was very specific to Washington, D.C. There are a lot of national labs here. There were enough African Americans to be able to capture, so that's why I focused on this region. But I think that in the survey of earned doctorates, what I'm doing now is doing something that others haven't done before, is that stringing together several waves to get a longitudinal study to figure out, again, what this pattern is over the lifetime of an individual, and an individual who's been participating in the innovation economy. So I think we still have the other studies have been snapshots, so what happens in one wave and so it's cross-sectional. But we'd like to know what happens over time and what affects their probability of success.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll second that. I'm not going to do it because I think you've got it covered, but that sounds like an amazing project and one that's really needed. My focus right now is really getting in touch with women who want to commercialize their research for my accelerator. And so I think there's a lot of questions that come up there in terms of how do we reach them? I can tell you recruiting for accelerators is challenging, and then recruiting for this kind of program, which is very needed, but also very, very niche audience, has introduced a higher bar in terms of the level of difficulty. But I would agree in terms of looking at the pipeline aspect. Just a personal story, I went to Mount Holyoke, which is a women's college, and there was a lot of, most Mount Holyoke graduates go on to do some sort of graduate degree or get a PhD, and a lot of them are in science, but there's no talk of commercializing that science. It was all, I'm going to better the world using my science and not make money off of it. But that is a valid goal, and I would argue it can be a better way to get that innovation out there. So looking at the pipeline in terms of what are those inflection points that drive anyone, but particularly women and other underrepresented scientists towards that particular pathway. Because I think if we understand those inflection points, then it's a lot easier to create effective interventions that aren't necessarily, say, about money, but could be, but more about that role modeling and mentorship aspect that we haven't really unlocked, and how to be very effective in a wide scale.
Same is true at Spelman. Yeah.
Barbara, did you want to talk about future research?
There are a few things on our wish list. One, I mean, you'd asked about what programs make a difference, what's working. I think we'd like to just do a scan of who's trying what's out there, what kind of results they're getting, whether they're evaluating and measuring changes over time, and how many women are patenting, let's say, in a technology transfer office. And then to kind of set the stage for wider, bigger scale evaluations that could potentially be funded by the government or NSF. Second, we'd like to do a survey of women scientists in R&D, women scientists working in both academia and industry, just to learn more about their attitudes about commercialization and inventing. Is it true or not true that they feel that their ideas, that they get proper credit for their ideas? Like if they're on patent teams, are they listed where they should be? What do they feel pessimistic or optimistic about their chances of getting venture capital? How does that connect to the real, what their real chances are in the world? I think, a lot of our data sources are pretty narrow in terms of our ability to understand people's experiences. And also, what are the cultures like that they're working within? Or are some of these cultures, say where women engineers are working, hostile, dog-eat-dog? Does that play a role in whether they're patenting, whether they're commercializing?
Questions from the audience? We'd love to hear from you. Yeah. Paul?
Yep. Just don't know how to do it. So I can't keep my mouth shut, and it's a genetic thing. I have a daughter who went through an engineering program in middle school and then in high school. It starts out with a number of girls, and ended with just her because she likes to speak her mind too. But basically, the girls were just ridiculed by these other kids, and the teachers didn't do anything to stop it. So my second daughter decided not to go engineering. She's going biology. It's fine with me, but I just thought I'd bring that up because you start bringing girls through, and they get ridiculed by the boys because they're not loudmouthed enough. But, is there anything you guys do any research on that?
I think that's a really good research idea. That would be interesting to look at in girls, how much they're being harassed, really. I mean, you can see it in popular culture. I have a 10-year-old, so I watch a lot of Disney Channel and that kind of stuff. And boy, being into science is social suicide. Like, that's probably a direct quote. Or math on these shows. So I just think in some ways we need to kind of address the way our whole culture thinks about STEM.
There's a lot of research going on among the learning analytics people, including at the University of Michigan. And what they're trying to figure out is why undergraduates leave certain fields. So engineering, physics, and unfortunately economics are right up there with respect to getting women and underrepresented minorities to leave. So what we're trying to figure out with these data is how we can change, how we can intervene to make sure that they don't leave. So it turns out for those three fields, we teach similarly. And there's no sense of everybody should stay in this field. Some people are prepared and some people are not. So I think that it will change with a culture shift and so one colleague in physics put together a chat room, an anonymous chat room whereby women could get homework help in an anonymous chat room, and they started subscribing to that much more than they would go see their TAs. And they closed the grade gap by doing that. So this is a big question that Claudia Golden is asking about economists. So why do so many women leave economics? So she's got this big research effort and big outreach effort to make sure that this stops, to figure out what's going on and to make sure that it stops. So we're looking at it, but it's going to take a long time to change the culture and coming up with these interventions and doing these experiments.
So I know that one of the computer science departments in either the UW system or the Washington State system, they had a curriculum where they had a weed out class, basically. And so at some point during sophomore year, you get this really difficult, let's make sure that we bounce everyone out who doesn't totally deserve to be here that we know of immediately. Well, they realized that that wasn't really an effective way of teaching and getting everyone who's interested in computer science the knowledge that they wanted. And so they took out that weed out class, or I mean, they still have the class, but they stopped framing it that way informally. And the number of grads of computer science went up by a third. So it was now a third of the class instead of like 10%. So there are some really interesting things that are happening in academic departments around the country who are realizing that this is an issue and that there are some fairly simple ways of looking at, you know, how things can be taught and the culture that can be created, so that we don't have this, we have an environment that is supportive of everyone. And then I think, you know, going back specifically to the more of the high school level, I think that teachers don't know how to address it. It's relatively new in terms of, you know, we know that this is happening and we know this has happened for a long time, but now it's become really to the forefront that it's the role of the teacher to, you know, talk about these stereotypes and biases and shut them down, or, you know, talk about them so they're out in the open and decide whether they're useful or not. I would say not, but so I think there's a lot of space there for more research into what is effective, and then, you know, trying some more pilot programs so that we don't have the situation where we have lots of girls very interested in STEM fields, and then through the culture that has existed, they decide that that's no longer something that they want to engage in.
We've got another question over here.
Yes. Hi, Mitchell Epner. I'm from Hughes, Hubbard & Reed, and I'm also here on behalf of the New York IPLA. I'm very encouraged in one way by the fact that this panel exists, and thank you for holding it. I also know that 27 years ago, I participated in a similar panel, and the numbers have not moved sufficiently, even though there have been a lot of efforts. So my question is directed towards what has been done over the last quarter of a century in order to study what's worked or seemed to work and what hasn't seemed to work, so that there can be best practices implemented. And I will give you a specific example from my background. When I graduated from college at Dartmouth, fewer than 20% of our engineering graduates were women. This year, for the first time, that number broke 50%. And there are specific things that have been implemented as best practices. And since you seem to be some of the leading academic practitioners in this area, do you know whether you or others are gathering best practices?
I think we need to do a better job, honestly. I know there is a body of research that's funded chiefly by NSF around gender and science in engineering and gender and race in engineering and other fields, STEM more broadly. I think, you know, sometimes that research ends up in journals or, you know, buried within websites, and that we need to kind of raise the profile of what is working beyond kind of just the anecdote at a professional conference that isn't public. And, you know, as we can, I mean, it seems like interest overall is increasing. That, you know, as companies are starting to release their data on how many women and minorities are employed, what they're earning, compared to white males and all of this, like there's a kind of a groundswell of interest, and perhaps there will be some new opportunities to kind of pull those lessons out of the dusty shelves of libraries and allow us to bring some effective practices to scale.
So part of the STEM to Market grant, which it's a program funded by the Kauffman Foundation. We're running these 3 cohorts, and the goal is to pilot some things, see what works, and then the end result is going to be a program in a box. So I'm not sure what that looks like right now because we're not through the cohorts, but my vision is that it's a toolkit that we could go to existing accelerators and say, hey, here's this thing, let me help you massage your curriculum so it addresses some of the things that are barriers to underrepresented participants and founders, and then also how to do this investor mentor program. And I think that we're going to get more of those sort of programs in a box types of toolkits because there's becoming a lot more demand for it. So I think AOS has done a lot of work in equitable workspaces. I'm not really sure if we have a toolkit per se where you could take it to a department at a university somewhere and say, hey, here's X, Y, and Z that you can implement. But I think it's really a matter of assembling rather than creating, given all the work that has been done.
I think that you and I have probably been observing over time. When I started my career in 1997 as an assistant professor, I was told not to do this research. I wouldn't get tenure. Like, it wasn't interesting, so these are senior economists, senior well-known economists, some who are doing this research right now. I was told that I wouldn't get tenure, I wouldn't be promoted, and it was not worth doing. I think there's been a sea change in even the thought, number one. Number two, now we have the capability to look at these learning analytics data, and there are millions just from a single semester of physics classes at Michigan State University. You can have millions of interactions. And we didn't have the computing power, the cheap computing power, to be able to analyze these. And we didn't have, the question is being posed now, so now we're trying. I don't think that there's a body of research that says these are the best practices. One thing that I found immediately in the first wave of data where I tried to identify African Americans, women in the data sets, was that AT&T, having some association with AT&T and with NASA, was really important for women and for minorities in terms of commercialization and in terms of patenting. And I'm still trying to figure out why that is. Now I'd be able to do more of that kind of investigation. Same true with the Patents and Ghettos paper that I've been working on for almost 10 years. So I think that there has to be will, it has to be cheap to do, and there has to be demand for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one last thing in terms of you asked what's been done historically. I mean, there is a set of policies that you might sort of term like affirmative action or quota systems. And I know it could be controversial and there are pros and cons, but I think if you sort of take the view that this is like a pipeline problem and you're never going to have like female professors until you have female grad students, then that might be sort of a reason for some sort of quota or action like that. And that's definitely something that's been done.
I see 2 people who want to ask questions. Maybe if you both just put your question out there and then we'll have our panelists respond. Steve?
Great. So you guys are talking about later stage college, high school. I'm a huge proponent of the First Lego League, first program developed by Dean Kamen that really gets children interested in a lifelong STEM careers. Perhaps you could speak a little bit towards engaging our young women at an earlier stage, elementary, middle school, so that funnel is larger as our women move through the education ecosystem.
Terrific. And your question?
Sure, thank you. I'm Matthew Dowd. I'm a patent attorney here in Washington, D.C. And this topic really hits home for me because I have the pleasure of being married to a scientist and an inventor. She's a chemistry professor, and so she's worked hard over her career and done very well. But I have seen firsthand the difficulty of trying to progress your research, work long hours in a laboratory, get that tenure status, which is really critical in terms of taking your career to the next stage. And very often, all of this occurs during the prime childbearing years of a woman. And I'm just curious, I think, Barbara, you mentioned it briefly, but if you could expand a little, it's a little different than staged on Steve's question, but in terms of best practices, have you studied that? Have you compared what academia does compared to private industry with respect to time off, parental leave, and then how it affects the tenure process, at least accommodating the fact that women in general bear the brunt of caring for children at home? Thank you.
Yeah, it's there has been a lot of investment in that particular set of issues. Like the NSF Advance program, especially, has invested in kind of institution-wide efforts to do things like extend tenure clocks for new parents, create better paid leave programs, and they do seem to make quite a big difference. And one of the often striking to me findings about adult scientists is women scientists are much less likely to be married than male scientists, which is, to me, potentially, I mean, not necessarily a sad state of affairs, but is it that, if you're playing kind of a traditional female role in the household where you're both trying to work as a scientist and doing more childcare and more housework, which we know happens from time use data, that it just becomes more or less impossible. And the SBA study that I mentioned earlier about that looked at faculty members found that just the amount of time that people spend doing research is highly associated with patenting, and that women tend to be in faculty positions that involve more teaching, either because they're at less prestigious institutions that are less likely to be R01, high prestige research institutions, or just that they don't have as much time. So that's one of the things that we've seen. So I think there's been a tremendous amount of progress, but you hear a lot about the promising examples, the great stories at the University of Michigan or at the R01s. I think it really has to permeate throughout academia as a whole. And on your question, I'm an advisor to a National Girls Collaborative Project, which is a network of programs that encourage girls to get into STEM. And there are tons of them all over the country. I think the place we need to work at it a little better is programs that reach low-income girls, girls that aren't in in economically stable neighborhoods, and to be able to think about what's the full complement of supports that they might need that might have nothing to do with learning STEM, but transportation or just someone who's helping them think through the logistics of their lives.
There have been a lot of these programs, but they haven't been systematically evaluated. So in economics, we've had this CSWEP program for women in economics, and it has been recently evaluated. There's been this running experiment for about 10 years now, but there are very few programs that have been systematically evaluated, which means that the evidence is not going to be at a sufficiently high enough level to be promoted, to be published. I mean, let's put that aside, and then to persuade policymakers. And when I say policymakers, so deans and provosts and presidents and NSF and NIH to support this. So we have this endogenous cycle, in a sense, that needs to be broken.
I think also going back to those kinds of parental leave policies and those experiments, I think it's headed in a good direction with regards to the actual benefit in terms of parental leave, but the culture change around actually taking advantage of those benefits is not there. So, yes, you have the opportunity to pause your work towards tenure, but too bad for you if you take it. So there needs to be more, leadership and cultural change coming from the top in terms of, visibility and praise, for taking advantage of these things, as well as for, like I said, a culture of mentorship that changes the community in terms of how everyone is interacting with each other. I mean, yeah, academia is competitive because there's only so many tenured spots, but at the same time, we do have an opportunity to work together to create more innovation instead of competing ourselves to a lesser level.
I just wanted to also add to the question about what can be done to engage young women, because I do agree with Lisa's point that there are a lot of programs out there and they haven't necessarily been evaluated and whatnot. But one thing that I have seen from my research that's really clear is that kids are more likely to be inventors if they grow up in a neighborhood or a community where there are more inventors. And this is particularly true about young girls growing up with female inventors as role models, and similarly for young boys growing up with males as role models. So I think that speaks definitely to a wide class of programs and their effectiveness for mentoring and role modeling.
So if we're not going to move everybody into neighborhoods where there are either male or female inventors, we need to have a Hidden Figures movie come out every single year. People will go someplace and see these inventors and these role models. Yeah.
But more seriously, there could be efforts to sort of integrate communities.
I'm not playing. I'm not playing. I'm serious. I'm totally serious. There was a bump in the number of computer scientists number of students who majored in computer science during the Cosby Show, when there was actually it was a spinoff from the Cosby Show, where there was a cool engineer who was in the middle of everything. And we see that bump, but we're too, I don't know how I should say it, we don't want to study that. We don't want to study the fact that a television show, a popular television show, has resulted in this bump, and how can we recreate that? I mean, so I'm saying that there's a lot that we can do, and I don't want to underestimate what science fairs can do, sort of busing kids to science fairs, or having a Hidden Figures movie come out every year, or something like it come out every year.
So are you suggesting road trip to Hollywood?
Road trip to Hollywood. I'd be there. I'd be there.
Well, I'm afraid our time has come to an end, but we have an offer on the table that I think Lisa has made to us, which is that we could have a higher GDP if we would just take this seriously and do more about it and learn from best practices. So please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for their work today.
So I'm going to start by introducing our moderator, David Kappos, who will interview Representatives Gosar and Foster. And again, thank you so much for being here, all of you. We really appreciate it. David was the Undersecretary of Commerce for Intellectual Property and the Director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office from 2009 to 2013. As PTO Director, he advised the President, the Secretary of Commerce, and the administration on intellectual property matters. And as many of us know, he was one of the most successful USPTO directors and really introduced some incredibly important policy changes within the PTO. Under his leadership, the USPTO reduced the backlog by tens of thousands of applications, despite a decrease in the number of patent examiners and an increase in the volume of new filings. Dave also oversaw the passage and implementation of the America Invents Act, one of the most significant pieces of patent legislation in the past several decades. Prior to joining USPTO, Dave Kappos led the Intellectual Property Law Department at IBM as Vice President and Assistant General Counsel for Intellectual Property Law at IBM's corporate headquarters. In this capacity, he was responsible for the management of all the company's IP interests, patents, trademarks, trade secrets, and copyrights on a worldwide basis. Over the course of his career at IBM, Mr. Kappos held intellectual property law positions in nearly all of IBM's business units. He wrote and prosecuted patent applications in many different technical areas and has considerable firsthand experience with prior art searches and an applicant's perspectives on the examination process. Dave is currently a partner at Cravath, Swaine & Moore, where he works on intellectual property issues, and I think, as we all know, he's become one of the most ardent and effective champions of the patent system in the U.S. today and worldwide. So please join me in thanking Dave Kappos for joining us today. And Dave, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that great introduction, Lori. It's a pleasure to be here in Washington, D.C., and to return to the offices of Covington, which does such a great job of hosting. Let me start by saying thanks to the organizers, the Covington folks, and the other organizers of this event, and for your continuing efforts to make intellectual property issues a topic of discussion in Washington, D.C. There's plenty of things to discuss here. Intellectual property needs to be on the agenda. Let me move from there and say thank you very much to Congressman Gosar and Foster for coming here today. Let me just start by saying the most important thing that you could do is the thing you've already done for us, those of us who believe that innovation is a cornerstone of our country's global leadership, and that is to come here today and spend time with us. So thank you very much for doing that. It's a huge honor to have you here. Let me start with some introductions of the two members of Congress who've joined us today in alphabetical order. Bill Foster is a congressman, is a congressman from Illinois. And is representing the 11th congressional district there, is a scientist and a businessman, right? He serves on the House Committee for Financial Services, position that he also held in the 110th and 111th Congress, the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. Congressman Foster participated in the creation of several important reforms in the financial services and housing sectors, most notably Dodd-Frank, Wall Street Reform, and Consumer Protection Act. I should mention Congressman Foster is the only physicist in Congress. His business career began at the age of 19 when he and his younger brother co-founded Electronic Theater Controls, Inc., which is a company that now manufactures over half of the theater lighting equipment in the United States. Congressman Foster's scientific career was as a high-energy physicist and particle accelerator designer at the Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory, known as Fermilab. So pretty impressive scientific and business background to intersect with the intellectual property community. Congressman Foster lives in Naperville, Illinois, with his wife, Asuk, who is also a physicist, has two grown children, Billy and Christine, and his father was a civil rights lawyer who wrote much of the enforcement language behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I mentioned the family comments both because they're obviously extraordinarily important to everyone, but also because one of the people that I mentioned, Billy, is an IP lawyer in Chicago, Illinois, as I understand it. So very significant intersection with the intellectual property innovation system. Congressman Paul Gosar, thank you, Congressman Gosar, for joining us, is serving in his fourth term in Congress as a representative from Arizona's 4th Congressional District. Arizona, a great state out in the part of the country that I'm also from. I'm from California, so know and love Arizona very much. First elected in 2010, came to Congress with fresh eyes and has taken on Washington, D.C. that way. Congressman Gosar believes that the Constitution is the cornerstone of our republic and pursues policies that allow for more individual liberty and less government involvement. And of course, we'll hopefully get to talk a little bit about the role of the patent system as a constitutionally recognized right here in our country. Congressman Gosar has focused his legislative work on natural resources issues and government accountability. Maybe we can come back to that second point a little bit too. Both areas stem from his work on the House Committee on National Resources and Health, and the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. Dr. Gosar is chairman of the National Resources, Energy, and Minerals Subcommittee and Vice Chairman of the Oversight and Government Reform Interior Subcommittee. So important connections in the natural sciences and government oversight. Just a couple more comments. Dr. Gosar has managed to be extremely effective in the time that he's been in Congress, dealing with the gridlock that we all face here. He was recognized in 2012 as one of the hardest working and most effective members of Congress, and Congressman Gosar raised the bar even higher during his second term with 6 bills signed into law by the President, 12 other legislative efforts becoming law, and 24 of his amendments passing the House, which all of us who work in the intellectual property area know how hard it is to get that done. One of these legislative victories was the most important bill that passed Congress during this time frame, facilitating a land exchange that will allow the creation of 3,700 new jobs and generate $60 billion for Arizona's economy. So that's quite a remarkable achievement in that number of billions of dollars of addition to a state economy. Lastly, before being elected to Congress, Dr. Gosar owned his own dental practice and was a small businessman in Flagstaff for 25 years. So great to have you here with the background in business. Well, gentlemen, thanks again for being here. And let me get started with a question for both of you. I'm going to read just a short passage from an explanation that was given to me by a tech transfer officer at a great university. It could be one in one of your states. It is out west, but we don't need to get into the details of the university. The way I learned about this is on request from another member of Congress, polling around with tech transfer officers in great universities around our country and asking them about what's going on with the patent system and how it is impacting the ability of businesses, of startups out of their universities to get traction and get into the marketplace. And here's one of the stories that was read to me by a tech transfer officer. He said, our researchers discovered the gene that correlates with fetal alcohol syndrome, a disease that is a leading cause of cognitive defects in babies, affecting thousands of newborns per year in the US alone. A patent application was filed in the USPTO, but was rejected under Section 101, the part of our Patent Act that determines the threshold of what can possibly be patented. So this person says, tech transfer officer says, rejected under Section 101 with the invention declared per se ineligible for patenting. Then he says, ultimately the patent application was abandoned. As a result, the startup formed to carry forward the research and develop a treatment for this terrible disease was unable to raise funding and ceased to work. Directly owing to the current U.S. patent policy, more children are born every day with severe cognitive disabilities, and directly owing to U.S. patent policy, more Americans per year will not get to realize their potential and will not get to contribute to society. So this is a pretty stark way, to sort of face the patent system. It's actually deteriorated to the point where American babies are being born with severe defects that don't need to be. I wonder if you could just both comment on, and this could be people from your districts, statistically it probably are people from your districts, what is going on that's causing this?
Well, when you mentioned universities starting out, the first thought I had was that the university is sort of it's a non-practicing entity, right? Which there's a lot of vilification of non-practicing entities these days, and when my immediate response to that is, yeah, like universities that do this sort of very valuable research, and removing the incentive for them to have tech transfer programs would be, catastrophic. Certainly to my alma mater, Wisconsin, which was sort of led the way in many ways in developing the tech transfer and was very aggressively pursued its and successfully pursued its intellectual property coming from it. The business of of patenting biological systems and the human, that's very personal. You know, that's sort of a tough issue, because I think if you ask the average American, that you'd get a split, and it wouldn't follow partisan lines, but it's a very personal thing when you talk about, you know, who owns the information in your genome or the population's genome. So, you know, that I think is going to remain a very tough issue. And it hasn't stopped. For example, the real answer to that problem is that there are now these companies developing handhold full genome sequencers that will get the answer in 10 minutes. So I'm looking forward to going to some reception somewhere, shaking someone's hand, and then 10 minutes later they'll post my genome to WikiLeaks. Okay, which is, which is a serious problem for the privacy. But that's a sort of innovation that, you know, is driven by our patent system, and we have to preserve that. But it's, I don't know, it remains a tough one. The specifics of patentability of human genome. At different times of the day, I go different ways on that personally.
Well, this is also one I'm going to approach a little differently, and coming from ASU in our state of Arizona, Dr. Crow has developed an incubator system so that some of these ideas that may have negativity at the front end are embraced and supported and move forward, so that they actually have the weight of the university to help them get along that way, and actually to reapply that patent at a different time. Dr. Crow has done a kind of an ingenious idea of trying to move those aspects forward. But being a dentist, along those lines, this is a whole new realm, because as Bill talked to you, I mean, we're going into genomics fast. And what it's going to be able to do is you're going to be able to tell about what you're going to need medically by the basic genomes of what you look like and target. So this is the whole future on that application. And privacy does play a point in that application. But the furthering of medicine is going to be very, very important along those lines.
So just going a little bit further into that, there's the philosophical, ethical, personal issues that we all face about, do I like the fact that my genome can be patented, something like that. But then when you talk to the tech transfer officers, right, Arizona, Illinois, Wisconsin, wherever, they're facing a very practical problem. Our scientists have created a new cure for a disease. They want to put it into the marketplace, and to do that, funding is required, and they can't get funding unless they've got patent protection. So come back and talk a little bit about that, sort of just very practical. We want Americans to be healthier. To do that, we need capital to be brought against invention, and it only happens when you've got patent protection.
Sure. Well, it's a huge engine of growth. It has been for a while. When we started our company, we started it with $500 from my parents, and it now manufactures, actually it's up around 70% of all the theater lighting equipment in the U.S.
Okay.
But we've been on both sides of patent fights. My first interaction with the legal system of the U.S. was getting deposed for a claim of infringement by our product. And so this is it's one of those things like, if you've ever been divorced, you're very grateful that you have a well-functioning legal system that really treats with rules that have been thought out. And if you've ever been in a patent fight, having a patent system that's well thought out, that really balances the legitimate interests of everyone, it's a tough problem. And when I look at the forces that have changed over time and how they're being reflected politically today, if you look back at my grandparents, I've come from a long line of inventors, and then we get into this generation skipping thing with lawyers and inventors and lawyers and inventors. But my great-grandfather invented one of the windmills. There are two kinds of windmills, the kinds with the blades that fold over and the other kind with a vane. And he, at that time, this was an invention that he could explain to any jury. It was an invention that he would shut down factories that were infringing on his invention, and he could explain that to anyone. And my son, skip 4 generations down, my son is getting involved in the phone wars. You probably know better than I do the cases he's involved in. But you're sitting there with a smartphone where you have to license or infringe, 1,000 patents to manufacture a smartphone. So the complexity of inventions that are of economic importance now is one of the big drivers to that. Also, that complexity is being reflected, the so-called digital economy generates a large number of natural monopolies, or at least very large companies. The returns to scale in the digital economy are enormous. And so that has changed the political and economic actors in Washington significantly. Unfortunately, probably in a way that has caused us to weaken the patent system more than we should.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look politically, when there's a group of people that you have to assemble to stand up for the patent system, like the press conference we had, I guess, against the Innovation Act about a year and a half ago.
Mm-hmm.
It was really interesting to see the members there. I mean, you had me, and you had Thomas Massie, he is like about the farthest right Tea Party, I guess now Freedom Caucus member. Yeah, on the far libertarian. He and I agree on approximately nothing, but it turns out that he's an MIT robotics grad with a strong constitutional interest in a strong patent system. So you've got this very interesting set of people, everyone from John Conyers to Tom Massie, standing up in defense of the patent system because it has touched our lives, our careers in such a way that we know how important it is.
I'm going to approach it a little bit differently. And as a healthcare provider, we're going into new realms that we've never thought about before. Our genomes, our genetics are our own personal pieces of identity. But it's also a key link to how we treat the diseases of the future and today. I'll give you an example. I'll use me as an example. I'm allergic to wheat and gluten. I'm one of those celiac people, and there's a genetic link there. And so by identifying me early in life, where I can identify my problematic and maybe my how I handle myself in that realm of what I eat, how I take care of myself, that's going to give me a better outlook for my health care. But how do I implore that or work with that with an insurance industry, within a medical system that's not ready for that yet? We're way beyond the aspects of where we're going with science, and yet the precursors of how we pay for it and how we hold accountabilities and the privacy are way, way back here. So I don't look at the situation of saying no being a problem. I think it's a warning sign that we need to spend more time and due diligence to understand where we're going, how we're going to go, and put the protections in there that are warranted for that personal privacy aspect. I'm a very big advocate. I'm like Thomas Massie. I've got a libertarian tendency to me on privacy. But I also see the benefits of what genetics will teach me about my health care. I mean, it's not just in celiac sprue, it's in cancers. I mean, the advancements here are incredible about what we're looking at and how we can drive that. So I don't think the timeout is all that bad, because I think it's in a realm that is very controversial, and I think we need to sort it out. Those who go fast tend to fail. When you sit back and relook at that, I think that you bring people up to snuff all along the same aspects so that everybody's included in the process.
So a couple of great comments. So you bring up points that make me feel like we need to go just a little bit deeper, because these are really great points. The celiac point, very salient. It's an issue of diagnostics, right? And we are in our country in a revolution, in a beyond renaissance of diagnostics, brought on by the ability to understand the human genome, largely. And that is resulting in tremendous opportunity for detecting, enabling people to deal with issues like celiacs and many others, and then enabling them to treat those issues, whether through biologics or palliative or other kinds of treatments. The issue for the IP system is, with the Supreme Court having declared that diagnostics, that discoveries and diagnostics are essentially unpatentable, I worry a lot about investment just moving away from those areas, and this rate of discovery that we are now at the threshold of realizing slowing down, because there's no board of directors that will approve senior management to invest in discoveries, diagnostics that can't be protected, that will be appropriated by competitors in the marketplace. So I'd love to hear comments from both of you on how we think about this balance where diagnostics are such a huge opportunity for our country, but yet the Supreme Court has said the whole field is not subject to patent protection.
Yeah, well, this is a problem that's going to get worse.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the discovery of your celiac problem, that is an example of what is now done by the Genome-Wide Association study. I think GWAS is the and so what they just take your whole genome, they take all the biological conditions of a big population, they give it to an AI, and the AI tells you, okay, here are the associations, or just even a big correlation program. And so the question is, what fraction of that is patentable? If you think about, there are companies that are developing very advanced AI systems right now that will design products from a very high level specification. And trying to understand the patentability there, it's my understanding that just identifying a problem is not currently patentable. But if you can take that identification of the problems, for example, in case of my grandparents, it was design a machine that will convert wind power into electricity. Mm-hmm. All right, and there are programs under development that know about every kind of lever and knob and generator and blade that can exist. You can, and it will just try all configurations of that, optimize them in an AI sense, and come up with a patent filing for this invention. That all you have done is identified the need for a device that will do that, convert wind power to electricity, and then it will do that. So where is the incentive for that? Where should it be? And the problem is not going to go away, and it's coming at us faster than a lot of people realize. I mean, there are startups doing exactly in fact, if I ever lose an election, I think I may join such a startup because it sounds fascinating.
I agree with Bill. It is coming very, very fast because the advancement of science is going so much faster than the ability to keep up. I look in the healthcare realm, and we've been at ASU going back to them at their incubator stage, where they're actually on the edge of cancers, where they're actually looking at genome typing. You may have kidney cancer, but they're actually treating you for lung cancer based upon the genome and then the calibration of where the cells are being derived from. This is a hard one to look at because I think there's other players that haven't been heard from. I've been a proponent of updating a payment mechanism through the insurance industry, a revolutionary aspect of getting competition within the insurance industry that would actually help along those lines. But this is a really tough deal because, as you know, Congress doesn't respond very fast. I mean, we're pretty polarized as we speak. And we're even having this discussion in regards to healthcare. It's broken. I don't care what you say. I'm one of these guys that said I didn't like my healthcare before, I don't like it now. And we need to dream something different, something very different. And diagnostics are going to play a huge part to that. And I think that what ends up having to happen is we need to put that patient first. We need to look at the innovator first and see if there is something that we can work out in accordance with that. And I don't know that Congress is the best answer for that because I don't think anything's coming fast on any front along those lines. I just hate to tell you that. So I think that we're going to have to come up with a better idea from the breadth of the innovating environment to how do we approach this diagnostics to be able to patent it? How do we define it in a better light that's currently not being defined in the current stage? So I think that's going to be how do we look at that definition and how do we implore it to work in today's age?
Yeah, very, very helpful comment. And just to close on that subject, one of the great promises of advanced diagnostics is that they not only can ensure that people who will respond well to treatments will get those treatments, but it also ensures that people who won't respond well won't get the treatment. So the insurance companies wind up saving on not treating people who shouldn't be treated, and also on the hospitalization costs for those people who shouldn't have been treated but got treated in the old days and got sick as a result.
What it's doing is it's giving you a guiding light about where to drive instead of just blindly saying, okay, these are the chemotherapeutics that actually work relatively well in this arena. You're targeting, and that is very specifically different. And so once you start to see that, I'll give you an example in dentistry. I was very forward in dentistry. I didn't like cutting down a crown all the way. And I got to see some renovations or some new innovations in modified ceramics where you actually took very minimal pieces of the tooth off And you took an impression, and they built that crown up based upon this ceramics that was bonded to the tooth. Amazing what you could do with that tooth. Implants are another application. And so you start to see those, the way they renovated and just recalibrated all the way we do dentistry. It's amazing, but it takes time to catch up.
Okay, great.
And also, in defense of the patent system, I think one of the big, ultimately the cure for your celiac condition will be genetic engineering with CRISPR-Cas9, and it's one of the big fights in patent law is who owns the CRISPR-Cas9 IP. And I think that's at least progressing. And when a winner is identified and the licensing, assuming the system is working well, that's going to allow a huge number of companies to jump in, license it where necessary, and actually get it going so that you'll have cures for things like this.
Right. Good. Yeah. It's super important. Congressman Foster, you mentioned a few minutes ago some, I think I'll use my word, deterioration or degradation in the patent system. I want to come back to that for a minute and get comments from both of you. There was a recent report from the chamber here in D.C. publicizing a study that's put out annually by an Israeli consilium that measures about 50 or so objective indicia of patent system strength across many countries. And the U.S. has historically been number one. In fact, this report has come out now for 5 years. The first 4, the U.S. patent system was rated number one. Shockingly to many of us, including myself, this year the U.S. dropped out of the number 1 spot, not just to the number 2 spot, but all the way to the number 10 spot. So we are now the number 10 strongest patent system in the world, behind a number of other countries, including Italy and Singapore and countries that you'd say, what is going on here? So I wonder, does this deterioration of the strength of the U.S. patent system, as you've both said, it's all about balance. You don't want a system that's either too strong or too weak. How do you feel about what's going on, and has the balance shifted to a point where the narrative really needs to change about the strength of the U.S. patent system?
Well, it has changed as far as I'm concerned. I just think that on average, things are a lot weaker. When I just talk to people with startup ideas, lots of times, it is, the first questions they get asked by their investors are, how solid is your IP? And a lot of skepticism that might not have been there about whether, this is particularly, what was there was a recent decision there's Apple and Samsung, I think, which said that basically just go ahead and infringe and then we'll figure out what slice of revenue you get later. And this is a very different model than my great-grandfather going and shutting down a factory because they were infringing his design for a windmill. Okay, and this is sort of shifted. I think if you're a constitutional purist, it's hard for me to at least read the Constitution and understand how they got to that point where, go ahead and infringe and we'll do monetary corrections later, for which there's an argument, particularly when you get complex products. But this is something where I think we've just shifted too much, and that it's damaging startups a lot, and it's a source of huge frustration for manufacturers of cars or cell phones or very complex things that they have to go and deal with all of these garage inventors. And I understand that, but I think we've gone off balance and we're not incenting the garage inventors to the extent we should.
They're real disruptors.
Yeah, I think there's 2 points to this. Number one is enforcement of patents, and I think that as you'll allude to that study, China's number 1. And they've been one of the biggest purveyors of illegally taking patents. So I think that number 1 is how do we address that and protect on an international scale is key. And then the second one is shows you the lack of a dynamic economy in this country. Because through dreamers, through innovators, is how you build an economy. And when you have liquid funds, when you have accessible funds for R&D, that makes it much more accessible to invest, to see the products of those investment rewards. So I think there's 2 parts to this, and I think we ought to be, as a group, very interested in what tax reform looks like, how it benefits the dreamers, the innovators. Where is that benefit for R&D? And then how do we step up the enforcement application on an international scale? I think those are two big keys that I think that we have to address. And I think if we address those right, we'll be back on top.
Yeah, great comments. Both the R&D incentive that brings financial resources to great ideas and the enforcement on the back end. And going back to Congressman Foster's comment, the injunctive right needs to be redoubled and strengthened so that this property interest, the patent right, is something that people will respect.
Yeah, and there's a huge problem, particularly with pharma, about the rest of the world freeloading on our research and development. And I don't know any easy solution to that, but I'm open to suggestions. Because part of it is, giving cheap drugs to Africa or places that are really suffering and have no realistic way of paying for the R&D cost. I guess I'm okay with that, and I become less okay when you start going to first world countries doing the same thing. And trying to figure out how to handle that fairly and internationally is a tough nut to crack.
Yeah, I mean, I can't solve the problem, but I can certainly echo the sentiments. Spending a lot of time myself overseas, including in China and other places, I see that the world has outsourced its medical innovation, its pharmaceutical and life sciences innovation. They've outsourced it to us, the U.S. And so we get to pay the healthcare bill essentially for the rest of the world.
Well, and I think Bill brings out that question. We have to have that conversation, but I don't know that we have everybody sitting at the table to have that conversation. I.e., I'm going to bring back kind of an unusual player at this aspect, and that's the insurance industry. When you start looking at best management practices, and all of a sudden I can start streamlining that, and particularly when I look at competition, increased competition within the insurance industry, all of a sudden I'm going to see a lowering in those rates of pharmaceuticals based upon best management practices. So there's also market forces that we have to take into consideration that we haven't taken into consideration as well.
So let me go from there to, you mentioned Congressman Massey a few minutes ago, and I believe he tweeted recently something along the lines of, quote, "Every day Congress is in session, there are lobbyists here trying to weaken the patent system." And so, end quote. Comments on that? Are you seeing some of that going on?
Never. I mean, what's the ratio is like? It's order of 6 lobbyists per member of Congress, on all subjects. And so on financial services, I think it's like 30 to 1. But it's a real problem. And so you just have to solve it by electing people that are thinking all the time about the people they represent and trying to, and dealing with the problems of money in our politics are, it's an existential threat to our democracy, and it's a problem.
I would agree with Thomas. Thomas is a good friend of mine. He's a very independent thinker. But I mean, when you start looking at in the framework of a constitution, when you actually highlight the innate strength that our framers put into the dreamers, the patent rights, it was meant for the small guy, because when you lose the small guy, you lose the whole system. And so when you see here, business is big, everything's big. I'm from small town America, I'm from small town dentistry, I'm from small town this and that. That's what's being lost in the shuffle, is the magnitude of the small, the little guy, and making sure that it's not the big Microsofts or the Googles or whatever that are actually taking over those things in a rush to get it. That's why I'll be very honest with you. I was not a fan, and I voted against the first to file instead of the first to find, because it had detrimental applications to the small guy. And that's why it was so important when you read the Federalist Papers, why it was so demanded of and placed specifically in the Constitution for that very protection.
Yeah, and I have to say I had some reservations too. I was also terrified recently when some intellectual property lawyer mentioned to me that there was now a problem where Chinese hackers would come in and hack law firms, and right the day before you were about to file your patent, all of a sudden some Chinese firm files a substantially identical patent, and it's clear they had been looking at your, and so that's one of the dangers with first to file. And I don't know how significant. I'd be interested in measuring the eye contact in the audience and seeing how significant that is, but it's the sort of thing that probably will not go away.
Yeah, not surprising, I suppose, in the age of cyber espionage, right?
Yeah, but it's a danger with first to file because you could, you know, they obviously couldn't make a big fake laboratory that had invented this thing. Whereas if it's first to file, that's the end of the discussion.
Right, yeah. Coming back to the Constitution just for a minute, it's a great comment. You know, the Bill of Rights came along, of course, slightly after the original Constitution. The Constitution itself essentially has, you know, one public right that's provided in it, and that's the invention clause, right, and the patent right, and the copyright right, inferentially also. So it's very fundamental. It came from an age in which other countries had kings and queens and czars who were deciding who got patents, and we decided we wanted it to be a right that was guaranteed to people who made inventions. So, you know, just again to endorse that you're right on with it being clearly correlated with giving the little guy a chance to do something disruptive. And I would argue that little companies, big companies, everybody benefits from having a system organized that way.
Well, that was the whole process of dynamic economies. You saw small businesses become big businesses based upon innovation. And that's when you have a healthy economy. You have a vibrant, innovative marketplace. People are coming up with new ideas, revolutionizing it, whether it be from energy, from infrastructure, from medicine, to cybersecurity. I mean, holy criminy. This is one of the big advances that we ought to be taking advantage of, is really going in after cybersecurity, because I can't think of better minds in the world than ours to actually unlock that nut and stay ahead of the world. I think that gives us a dominant position beyond anybody when we tackle those clues.
Right. Yeah, which by the way will require a lot of heavyweight software-related innovation, which comes back to needing to have strong incentives for folks to innovate and invest in that area.
Well, during my scientific career, I became very aware that there are lots of very, very smart Russians, Chinese, Iranians, you go down the list, okay, that they are just as smart as we are, and that, you know, anyone sitting at a computer is co-equal in terms of their ability to hack the universe. And so this is, you know, we can't just say, oh, you know, USA #1 and then imagine that that's going to that's going to be the final end of the story, that we have to provide the incentives through the system so that we have people that are motivated as well as having a seat at the internet.
Yeah. And I'm going to bring up a point here. You know, a lot of it, and Bill brings up a phenomenal point. Most of these countries, it's government dictated, where there's a freedom here. And the last time I looked is that entrepreneurial inventor is key to that point of view. Now, I was asked to debate a bunch of philosophers in the humanities in regards to this very issue about the power of government in inventing. And I said, it always comes down to the one person who has that idea that accelerates it, brings it to a point, then everybody can coalesce around it. That's the magic of the American dream versus any other country, is the dynamic of freedom, liberties, and the small guy getting protections under a constitution, not a king. That is so important to the application. I can't tell you. And the more you start to look at it, that was the power. That's why the Einsteins were here. That's why people matriculated here, because they were free to dream and build accordingly. And I think that's a power that we underestimate in today's dreamer world of innovation.
Yeah, great comment. It's all about innovation.
No, that also is shifting the complexity of modern inventions. You know, immunotherapy for cancer is just, you know, it's life-saving. It's some luck it may actually save my brother, who has stage 4 esophageal cancer, but has a targeted drug. But now, and I gave a floor speech not too long ago on immunotherapy, where I went through the whole pyramid of federally funded research on which that depends. And then the companies that actually took it to clinical trials and so on, or are doing it the trial that my brother's in, you know, they will be rewarded. And just understanding how, you know, the government is appropriately rewarded for its decades of unremunerated research that provided the intellectual basis for crossing the finish line with the immunotherapy clinical trial drugs. You know, that, for example, I think it's Israel that has a model that the government gets X% of tech transfer. You know, they get an equity stake in tech transfer endeavors, which I think is a very interesting model that provides incentives both for the government managers and to incentivize the right kind of research, as well as, you know, a private incentive. So we have to tend to that very carefully, because complex inventions are the work of sometimes generations of researchers, and not, the case of my grandfather inventing a new windmill off in his garage.
Yeah, so we're all building on the infrastructure of innovation that came before us. Comes back to the point of needing to provide long-term incentives and the right infrastructure in order to have people spend their time on innovation as opposed to everything else they could be spending their time on. All great comments.
And not just in this country, but so many of the therapies are you're tag teaming one institution, one individual here, and another expert in Lithuania, believe it or not, when you start looking at these complex issues. So how do we look at geographical boundaries as well along those lines?
Yeah, and so that probably gets to the last question we'll have time for, which is we've talked a lot about the innovation system, how to create more innovation. What would be for each of you the thing that you would do for your district and for our country that would draw more people into spending their time and resources on innovation?
I alluded to it first, or in my first comments, and that is at this current point, looking at the tax code, so that we actually see a renaissance in reinvestment into R&D and in innovation. I think that's going to be a key application, that's how you'll get it started. One of the biggest things I see in these incubators is the lack of funding. And this would give a jump start to those innovative incubators and to those innovators out there. If you don't have the funding, you progress at micro speed. And I think that right now what we could do the best is provide tax relief and incentives for there to be investment.
Well, if I could have one dream for the whole patent system, it would be, with the complexity of modern patents, you get in this situation, and they're both the technology and patent law. You're getting this situation where whoever has the weaker case in a patent negotiation, at least as part of that negotiation, maybe as an ultimate threat, is to go roll the dice with a jury that has a hard time understanding either the technology or the law. All right, and you see that, other countries don't do that. They have panels of expert judges. And the dynamic in negotiations is very different. If you know that you'll have to explain your case, not to a jury who may be very sympathetic for reasons that are spurious to the logic of the case, but to people, to a set of experienced judges that know the patent law cold and know the technology pretty well, that would change it. Now that, I think you get to constitutional amendments to make that happen, is my guess. Though it seems like what's been done to patent law involves already a pretty creative reading of the Constitution. And so that maybe there's additionally creative readings that may allow you to do that. The IPR is actually in principle, having a set of experienced, knowledgeable eyes have another look at a patent, but that's not, there's still ultimately, the threat to go to a jury. And so the idea of getting rid of the right to trial by jury in patent cases, which can be cleaved off from the rest of this, because it's a purely economic thing. This is not as, you don't need the safety valve in the same way you might need for, punching someone because he irritated you, and maybe the jury might have different views on that. That in this case, because it's purely economical, there may be a political window to have that happen. I have not met, there obviously, there are firms that specialize in being on either sides of patent cases more than others, but they all have stories, horror stories of juries doing ridiculous things. And so this is anyway, if I could have one dream, it would be to do that. And I'd be interested to see how many congressional co-sponsors we'd get on what was probably a constitutional amendment to get a more experienced set of eyes specifically on patent law.
So to get more issues moved away from juries and to judges. Just a last thing, that brings up the issue of courts, and particularly the Supreme Court. There's been, of course, a string of decisions the Supreme Court has made. Mentioned the eBay decision before, injunctions, moving away from injunctions, and there's been decisions, including in this term, that have all been directed toward sort of cabining or weakening the patent system. Do you see this as generating more energy in Congress for looking at rebalancing and maybe moving away from some of that Supreme Court law?
Well, the Supreme Court has not usually been split on these things. maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think they've been pretty clear decisions, which means there's something wrong with the law, not with the Supreme Court's interpretation of it. So I think that puts the ball in Congress's court to deal with, shifting the balance appropriately.
But I think it also is, instead of Congress doing big strokes or micro strokes, I think it's something going to be a fine line about how do you do that. And Bill brought up that there's an interesting mix of people, the Thomas Masseys, the Paul Gosars, the Bill Fosters. I mean, there's an interesting group of people that actually, cover a wide swath of political viewpoints that it could actually happen. I think it would be detailed about how specific you would make it, would be the champion of how it would actually move forward.
Yeah, well, I love the idea of some micro legislation that could be more targeted in cases. Well, look, I truly hope that with your two diverse perspectives, but joined by other diverse members that you've mentioned, we can have a whole new discussion in our country about the intellectual property system, about American leadership, about creating jobs and making the little guy the champion. And thank you very much for coming here today and for taking such an interest and such a progressive one in the IP system. Congressman Foster and Gosar, let me start by saying, for the whole audience, by saying thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you.
As it turns out, this is complicated, as someone famous once said.